Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
My name is Lisa Braun, and I know this might sound crazy, but I swear this wasn't in my head, despite what most people say. It all began when I was just a child. I remember it quite well. It was late one night. The moon was shining through the window and I heard a storm brewing in the distance. I woke up from a dead sleep to the sound of thunder. I knew it would be a long night, so I got up to get a book from my room. My family and I frequently would camp out in our living room, since we didn't care much for proper camping. This was one of those nights. Since my whole family was together, I felt safe. Guess I was wrong. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I stood up from the couch I had fallen asleep on and walked up the staircase that was right behind the couch. Once I was upstairs, I felt as though there were eyes peering into my soul. It was the most unsettling feeling I'd ever felt. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I felt my mouth dry up, and I felt shivers scurry down my spine. I hurried to my room, my heart beating in my head and my stomach in my throat, and slammed the door shut behind me, hoping the sound didn't wake my family below. In the confines of my small room, which I shared with my two sisters, I felt a slight relief. I found my book that had fallen beneath my bed and headed for the door. I stopped before opening the door, remembering that feeling I felt in the hall. I stood with my hands grasping the door handle tightly. I somehow mustered up the courage to hurry down the stairs and plant myself safely in the living room with the rest of my family. A couple hours had passed and I was on my second book. As I lay on the couch reading, I felt the same feeling creep into my mind and soul. I felt like the world had emptied, as though my family had disappeared, as though the couch was no longer under me. The feeling from earlier had returned, but it was more intense. I looked up to the corner where the staircase meets the wall, and to my dismay, something was there. I saw a dark, lanky figure staring at me. The thing that was up there was suspended in the air, clinging to the ceiling like it was hiding. The perfect hiding place to watch me as I read my books. I called for my mother, but no sound could escape my mouth. I couldn't move. That thing had a hold of me. I laid there helplessly, staring into the eyes of this entity. I began to cry at the sheer terror this thing was instilling. Suddenly it began to move. Its head cocked to the left, then to the right. It looked at me with intent. I should have expected its next move. I tried relentlessly to free myself from this waking paralysis, but to no avail. Finally, it flung itself down on top of me. It weighed at least the same as I did or more. I couldn't breathe. I looked over at my family all sleeping peacefully and I cried because I couldn't get their attention. I saw my sister's bed that we had set up in the living room begin to rise in the air. My heart sank. I was helpless. My sister was going to get hurt and I was just laying there watching. Her mattress suddenly dropped down with her on it. She began to scream and cry, which was perfectly called for. Suddenly the weight lifted from my chest and I could breathe again. My parents woke up and tended to my screaming sister and I calmed myself down. My sister was in hysterics while our parents tried to figure out what was wrong. She told them she was falling. My mother scooped her up in her arms and rocked her to sleep. I, on the other hand, knew that my parents wouldn't believe me, so I kept what happened to myself. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep, and that was the last I saw of the entity for a long time. 10 years later, my mother decided it was best for everyone if we moved back to the area she grew up in. We found a house in a small community about 30 minutes from the city. The first few weeks in the new house were quiet. I had thought we left our creepy house behind. But my relief was soon met with terror. On the second day of the third week in our new house, wasn't so quiet. Around 2:30 in the morning, I woke from a dead sleep with a sudden thirst. I made my way to the kitchen for a drink of water. And that's when I felt it. The same feeling all those years ago. Eyes staring deep into my soul. I turned around and saw the entity for the first time in 10 years. The entity stood hunched over at the end of the hall, patiently waiting to attack. It began to move. It cocked its head to the left, and then to the right. I didn't know what to do. I stood as still as possible, hoping it wouldn't see me. My sister stirred in her room, and the entity turned around. With the entity distracted, I ran to my room and slammed the door behind me. It walked up to my door and waited for me to come out again. I saw the shadow under my door and stared at it until the sun began to rise. I was so tired the whole day from staying awake all night long. I thought it'd be easy to sleep that night since I didn't sleep the night before. I fell asleep with ease but was woken up from a loud noise by my door. I saw the shadow again underneath my door. I shut my eyes as tight as I could and hid under my covers. I held my breath, hoping it didn't know I was there. After what seemed like an eternity, the entity went away, and I drifted off to a nightmare-filled sleep. The nightly visits continued. I prayed that it would just leave me alone. It's been 5 years since we moved here. I still live in the same house. My sister tells me she sees the entity now, hanging in the corner of her room over the door. The nightly visits stop for a bit, but I still hear the voices. Recently, I've started seeing the entity again, but it feels different. It feels more sinister, like it's waiting to get me alone. As I write this, it stands at the end of the hall. It's hunched over in its familiar pose, with a grimacing smile painted across its face. It's cocked its head to the left, then to the right. I fear that this time, I won't make it out alive.
Nearly 3 years ago, when the pandemic began, I moved my family to a small hamlet in the Scottish Highlands. I won't give you its name. I wouldn't want you to find this place. That being said, I can no longer keep this secret to myself. Before this life, I was a poorly paid security guard at a major bank in Carlisle. In December 2019, I was laid off. Over the following month or two, as the world commenced its descent into chaos, I frantically scoured the internet for any kind of job vacancy. Nowhere was hiring. Businesses were closing. Talks of lockdown had begun. I was worried my family and I would become homeless. There were no jobs in Carlisle. I widened my search to the entirety of Great Britain. That was when I found a perfect job listing. Neighborhood Watchman, £31,000 per annum, 7 days a week, midnight to 4 a.m. Civil service, funded by the Strathspey Council, includes residence for employee and family. Relevant experience preferred. Relevant experience baffled me because I'd never heard of a paid neighborhood watchman before. I was certain that no such job really existed. A neighborhood watch was merely a collective of concerned residents, surely. I couldn't believe that a council would really pay somebody to do that. I saw that dozens of people had already applied for the position. Time was of the essence. I polished my CV, placing heavy emphasis on the skills I'd acquired from 2 decades of security work for a bank. When I received an email from Harriet Glade to say that I'd been accepted for the position, I was ecstatic. I didn't have to let my family down. I didn't have to worry about being a failure in their eyes. We packed up and drove north. My 2 children, Rory and Grace, were a little disappointed that we weren't moving to Edinburgh or Glasgow. They were even more disappointed when they first laid eyes on the tiny hamlet that would become our new home. The job title suddenly made complete sense. I was to be a neighborhood watchman because this hamlet was merely a residential street in the middle of nowhere. There was a row of 6 terraced houses on one side of a long country road. In fact, everything in the hamlet was on the same side of the road. A little farther along, there was a small convenience shop, and just beyond that was a gargantuan house that would become our home. My children perked up when they saw the building. My wife gasped. I gasped. It was spectacular. When I read the word residence in the job advertisement, I had not expected something twice as big as our old home. It was 3 stories tall, and it overlooked the forest, which was a few hundred yards away. Between the hamlet and the wooded area was a large wooden watchtower, and it was about 70 feet tall. "Okay, this is cool. I forgive you, Dad," Grace said. I laughed. My wife kissed me on the cheek as I pulled into the driveway. Everybody clambered out of the vehicle, eager to explore the house. "You must be the Graysons." The voice came from the direction of the hamlet. I closed the car door and turned to face a short, elderly Scottish woman. She scurried towards me and held out a hand, and I shook it. "Harriet Glade," the woman said. "Karen Grayson, I presume." "That's me," I replied. "The house is beautiful." "Aye, so it is." Karen had assured me that the inside is shipshape, Harriet said. My wife walked over to introduce herself. "Faye Grayson," she said, shaking Harriet's hand. "Nice to meet you, Faye. How'd you feel about living in such an isolated place, eh?" Harriet asked. "Well, it'll take some adjusting," Faye said, clasping her hand around mine. "But I'll be fine. I work from home." "Oh, aye. When the internet's working, so do I," Harriet chuckled. "Do you mind if I ask something?" I blurted out. "Go ahead," Harriet replied. "This is a civil job, correct? And you work for Strathspey Council?" I asked. "Aye, that's right," Harriet replied, nodding. "I deal with administrative matters." "Well, we're a long way from Strathspey," I pointed out. "Why is this position so important to them?" "I'm not complaining about being hired for such a well-paid job, but it's a sizable investment from a town so far from here." It would be a sizable investment even if it had been a local council, I thought to myself. I still didn't understand why a neighborhood watchman was needed. "I suppose it's time to talk about your role, eh?" Harriet said, waving for me to follow her. "I'll take the kids inside," Faye said. "Have you got the keys?" "Our door's unlocked, dearie. Keys are on the table," Harriet explained. I remember thinking that such a lackadaisical attitude seemed out of place for a hamlet with its own watchtower. "But don't worry. I only unlocked it this morning," Harriet said, reading my mind. "I assure you that we keep our doors locked in this hamlet." "Where are we going?" I asked. "Karen's shop, which we like to use as a town hall when the need arises," Harriet explained. "He's the mayor of this hamlet, you might say. He supplies the food, he fixes broken things, and he makes the final call on all decisions." She led me into the store, which was deceptively spacious. In the center of the room, there was a clearing with 12 chairs. 2 were empty. A middle-aged man with a bushy beard rose to his feet. "Hello, Darren," the man roared jubilantly, raising his arms in a welcoming gesture. "It's nice to finally meet you. I'm Karen Green, and these are your neighbors." "Hi," a young woman sheepishly chirped up, raising a hand. "I'm Lottie. This is my husband, Dave. We have 3 wee ones at home. They're very excited to meet your weans." "Weans?" I asked. The room erupted with laughter. "English folk, eh?" Harriet chuckled and then smiled at me. "A wean is a child." "Oh, right," I laughed awkwardly. "Yeah, I've got 2 children. I'm sorry about that." The rest of the people in the room introduced themselves, other than 2 silent, sinister-looking boys. "And that just leaves these stoic teenagers," Karen said, motioning toward the 2 fearsome chaps who were sitting with their arms crossed. "These are my boys, Barry on the left, Richard on the right. They help me out at the store, but they don't talk much." Well, it's nice to meet all of you, I stammered. That's a lot of names. Karen chuckled, sitting back down. I know this is all quite overwhelming, and it's not even what you want to know, is it? I laughed uncomfortably, shrugging. Karen nodded, removing his glasses, polishing them with the bottom of his leather jacket, then placing them back on his face. This is a quiet road, Darren. It's a good place with good people. Karen stopped, his lip trembling. But it doesn't mean we're surrounded by good things, you know. My new neighbors murmured and nodded their heads in agreement. I see that the watchtower overlooks the forest, I said. Is there something dangerous in there? Karen paused for a long time. Aye, you could say that. I thought of all the deadly wildlife in Britain, and that it was exterminated centuries ago, I replied. Well, Karen hesitated. There are things in that forest. You wouldn't believe me even if I were to tell you. I was a little exasperated at this point. What exactly does my job entail? I know I only have to sit in the watchtower, but when would I sound the alarm, so to speak? You'd know, Karen promised, but I hope it doesn't come to that. He swiftly changed the topic by offering tea and biscuits to everyone. I didn't know much about Scottish wildlife, but I knew it wasn't particularly threatening. I couldn't see why a tiny hamlet would need a watchman to spot deer or Highland cows. I felt unsettled, to say the least. I was on watch 7 days a week. Faye didn't mind because my hours were short. Midnight to 4 a.m. 1,000 pounds. Fantastic. I had plenty of time to spend with my family, even though I'd sleep until midday. I remember being terrified on my first night as the watchman, so it was almost an anticlimax when nothing happened. Nothing happened for months. Well, a wild boar ran out of the forest in quite a state. I shooed it back. It was 20 minutes of excitement. Can I come up to the watchtower? I remember Rory asking as I tucked him into bed. Oh, it's boring up there, I laughed. Even being a security guard has more fun. Sometimes from my window I watch the forest with you, Grace said as I knelt down to kiss her goodnight. I smiled. Don't worry. I won't tell your mom that you were out of bed. Thanks, Grace replied. Could you tell Harriet, though? Basically doing the same job as you, and I wouldn't mind a 31,000-pound salary. I cackled until my eyes brimmed with water. 10-year-olds say the darndest things. Her 5-year-old brother always seemed confused by her quips, and that only made each situation funnier. Still, Grace's words rang true. What was I doing? Why was I being paid so much for this? I kept dismissing it as a bureaucratic oversight and continued to happily collect my money, but I didn't like the idea of performing a pointless service. Am I just doing nothing every day? I asked Faye. Half the world is trapped at home. They're doing nothing, my wife pointed out. This is a blessing, Darren. We've landed on our feet. Look at this amazing house. We wouldn't have ever been able to buy this place, even if we'd combined our salaries. How many people get such an incredible opportunity? Faye always had a way of soothing me. Let's just say, on a particularly warm night in the summer of 2020, she found a way to liven up my watch. The kids were having a sleepover with 3 youngsters at Lottie's house, and Faye kept me company in the watchtower. I think you get my drift. As we were getting dressed, I looked out at the glass pane that overlooked the forest. The blood drained from my face. Standing a few yards in front of the tree line was something on all fours. It looked like a man who had contorted his limbs, bending his arms and legs outward to walk like a 4-legged creature. Whatever black shape I saw, it immediately scurried backwards when it sensed my gaze. It vanished into the forest. Did you see that? I asked Faye. What? Are you worried someone was watching? My wife teased before clambering down the ladder and returning to the house. I was more vigilant than usual over the following weeks. Those 4 hours started to feel ceaseless. I'd keep my eyes peeled in the forest. Even blinking felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. I was actually working at long last, and I was exhausted. Fear had fatigued me. By December, I had decided enough was enough. I needed to start getting some proper sleep. I started to relax on my shifts. It was just an animal, I decided. As the temperature plummeted below freezing and snow began to fall, the daily watch grew more brutal. On one particular shift, I was shivering in my poorly insulated room at the top of the watchtower, watching white flecks cascade from the sky and obscure my view of the forest. I saw something. It was the first thing I'd seen since the haunting apparition. An ocean of snow had entirely coated the treetops and the ground below me, but I could faintly see black shapes emerging from the forest. I felt my soul vacate my body for a brief moment. I hadn't imagined the creature at all. It was real, and there were more than one of them. Black, spindly limbs slowly marched through the snow. I could see half a dozen of the things heading toward our hamlet. As I fumbled in my thick coat for the walkie-talkie, I saw that the creatures were huddling together and making their way towards my tower. "Karen!" I cried into the walkie-talkie. "Are you there? There's some sort of animal coming out of the forest." To my surprise, his response was instant. "You've done well. You've given us time. I need you to abandon your post and meet me in my store." I didn't need to be told twice. As I practically slid down the ladder from my tower, I squinted at the creatures through the thick waterfowl of snowflakes in the sky. Still couldn't really believe what my eyes were seeing. Let's just say that my curiosity wasn't as strong as my will to live. I didn't stick around to get a better look. I waded through white muck, fixating my eyes on Karen's shop, and refusing to look back. He was motioning for me to hurry up. Once I was safely inside, he bolted the door behind me. I suddenly realized that my family was there. Everybody from the hamlet was there. Faye, Rory, and Grace ran toward me, and I embraced them. "What's happening?" Faye whispered. "Everybody needs to follow Barry and Richard to the back of the shop. You'll be safe there," Karen ordered. The emotionless brothers nodded and started to lead the small group of residents to the door behind the till. "Not you, Watchman," Karen said, grabbing my wrist before I could join my family. Faye stopped and turned to face me. Richard grabbed her arm and shook his head. He insisted that my wife follow him. I heard her continue to ask what was happening as Barry closed the door and locked it. He and his brothers stayed in the main shop area with Karen and me. "Look," Karen said. I looked. Outside the shop window was the main road, snow-covered grass, then a blanket of darkness. It was a long, glorious moment of silence. Then, from the black void before us, the creatures emerged. I could finally see them clearly. My eyes had not deceived me. These things looked half-human, stripped bare, bodies coated in mud, and limbs bent outward. As the first creatures reached the road, I saw in their eyes black pupils. Their mouths were open, and their teeth appeared to have been sharpened. "What are they?" I asked in a breathless voice. "Aye, that's the question we can answer," Karen replied. "See why you would nay have believed me?" "What are they?" I repeated. "Used to be like us," Karen replied. "Folks say something happened in one of the old factories 30 years ago. Truth is, we don't know. But every once in a blue moon we see them. This is sooner than I expected. Before the last sighting in 2019, we hadn't seen them for 20 years. Now, a year later, here we find ourselves. Maybe they're getting less patient. This..." I paused, unable to think. "What do we do?" "There's only one thing that appeases them," Karen said. "And what's that?" I asked. A sudden thump on the right side of my face was certainly unexpected. I fell to the floor, clutching my wounded jaw, and I looked up at Karen. The bastard had sucker punched me. "I'm sorry, lad," Karen said. Other than the brothers, the people in there don't quite understand how it works. They don't know how we manage to survive. Sacrifice. That's what it takes. The brave Watchman died fighting the beasts. The beasts returned to the forest. We found another Watchman to take his place. You, the hero, the sacrificial lamb. You're crazy, I cried, crawling backward across the floor. As Karen strolled towards me, I looked out of the shop door on my left. The creatures were standing in the road. They were waiting patiently. I have 20 people to protect in my hamlet. Look, I'll make sure your family has enough money to set them up for life. Do this for them, Darren. We have to give the creatures something. We have to show them a wee bit of respect, aye? Karen shouted, growing flustered. I twisted my head to the right, looking for something in the store that I could use to defend myself. And don't think about calling to your family, okay? Karen warned. Otherwise, my boys might just let them out. The creatures might be treated to a bigger meal. I had an idea, but I had to act quickly. Okay, let's start this performance, Karen said, clearing his throat. What are you doing, Watchman? Now go out there. That's bloody suicide. Please, you don't need to prove anything to us. We can fight the creatures. I grabbed a heavy porcelain vase from the shelf next to me and launched it with all my might through the shop window. It shattered. No, Karen, I bellowed, using his own trick. Don't do it. The man did not have a chance to say anything in response. One of the creatures had already crawled through the broken window. The beast sunk its teeth into Karen's neck, claiming its trophy. The shopkeeper wailed as the creature dragged him over the broken glass into the night. Richard and Barry charged blindly after their father. I pulled myself to my feet and quietly backed toward the door behind the till. I didn't dare take my eyes off the creatures, but they were a little busy. Richard was faster than Barry. He swung his fist at one of the monsters that was dragging his father away. He fell flat in the road. Before the boy even had a chance to stand up, two of the creatures had set upon him. They frantically dug their pincher-like limbs into his body. I cannot quite describe the sound of agony that escaped his mouth as a cavity was created in his back and his blood began to paint the snow. All I can say is that the sound was short-lived and the creatures continued to hack away at his corpse until it was an indistinguishable pile of crushed organs and bones in the snow. Barry's fate was worse. His father had long been dragged away at this point, but once the surviving brother had pulled himself free from the state of frozen stasis, he charged through the broken shop window to avenge his brother. Two of the creatures had disappeared into the forest with Karen's body. The four remaining beasts surrounded Barry. When they pounced, they knocked him into the snow, and each of the creatures seized a limb. Moving in 4 different directions, the horrific creatures pulled at Barry's arms and legs. They pulled until the flesh started to tear and the bones started to break. Barry's screams were louder than those of his brother. The creatures continued to pull. Then, in beautifully horrific unison, all 4 limbs detached from Barry's torso at once. Like the most macabre choreography imaginable, the creatures brought their dance to a close. At this point, realizing I was the only one left, I fumbled with the door handle behind the till. I heard my family crying inside. Then I realized one of the brothers had the key and my heart sank. I was sure I would die. By some strange twist of fate, however, the creatures ignored me and followed their deformed friends back into the forest. I never told the people of my hamlet what Karen had done to the previous watchman. I didn't want them to know that the poor man had died unwillingly. I didn't want them to know that Karen had planned the same for me. Then again, am I any better? I offered the creatures a sacrifice, after all. I know I should leave this place. I should take my family and run. These people don't know what Karen had to do to protect them. And the creatures will return. whether 1 year or 10 years from now. And when that happens, what will I do?
One. A single white rose quietly fell from her slim young fingers. I looked down and saw it had landed on the dark walnut top of the casket. The beautiful wooden box somehow seemed out of place in the cold contoured hole in the soil. No one who stood encircled around this opening in the ground had expected his sudden death. And that's what it was. Death. One couldn't ease the outcome or pretty up the bluntness of today by calling it past, departed, or perished. When a loved one like David leaves this world in the manner he left, the only appropriate word is death. Cold, harsh, and final. Maggie May Duvain, or Magpie as she was called by many, clenched her smooth young hand, which had clutched the flower throughout the entire service. The back of her hand still moist from the teardrops she had constantly wiped away. Her eyes quickly replenished the flow. A constant stream of the salty liquid slid down her already saturated cheeks. There wasn't a dry eye amongst those gathered so tightly, all dressed in their Sunday best black. David would have hated that part, the black suits and dresses. I don't believe I ever saw David in a black suit. He despised the attire. The sound of Magpie's subdued whimpers rose above and then mixed with the myriad of echoes of the other's grief and despair, a sad melancholy tune of human emotion. It drew my thoughts back to why I was here. I remembered how David hadn't wanted to be buried. The whole idea of it freaked him out. The thought of being trapped under the ground in a box with worms and ants crawling around and feeding on his remains abhorred him. He'd insisted he would be cremated, and his wife would take those ashes on a trip to remember and either cast them into the Pacific Ocean on Oahu's north shore or nestle the small jar tightly into a rocky nook on Cana Point, a beautiful favorite spot on the farthest western point of the island. Lava had created the cliffs that overlooked a constant symphony of crashing waves, creating a kind of hymn they both loved. They had in fact met and fallen in love on that island so many years back. While now the two of them weren't the couple always holding hands every second of the day, they loved deeply and were devoted to one another. Those two spots out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean had been David and his wife's favorite places that they had visited together. David had said, "It might take one of us dying to get back there, but one day we'll return." A memory that now stung my heart, wondering if his words had somehow foreshadowed the reason we were now gathered. I wasn't certain why that wish of being taken back there was not kept, but it didn't feel like the proper time or place to question such a thing. Not now on this day. After all, I had recently moved away, chasing my dreams of writing novels up in the ruggedness of Alaska, much more than a stone's throw from Missouri. David and I, of course, kept up on each other's projects, critiquing and criticizing each other's work with bated tongues. No distance of miles could squelch that. Some friendships outlast about anything. Well, anything but death. There would be no recalibrating that fact and working around it, and that thought brought sudden anguish to me. David was not a replaceable friend by any means. Those weekly Saturday night phone conversations or Zoom meetings would now be no more. I was again drawn back to my purpose today by the sight of little Magpie holding her grandmother's hand. She grasped it tightly in one, the now missing white rose from the other, ripped my heart to shreds once more, like a scab being pulled away abruptly from a wound too fresh to be healed. It coldly reminded me that David was now lying in that lonely box laid in the ground, a final resting place he so adamantly feared. I glanced around the circle and surmised I wasn't the only one touched deeply by Magpie's brokenness in the moment. It was nearly more difficult than losing my good friend David itself, and just as his writing was becoming more recognized. What a shame he wouldn't be here now to see it or feel the kudos and acknowledgement of all the hard work he had done. Sometimes I believed he enjoyed living more in his world of dark fiction than he had in his real life, and I'll be the first to admit the thought had worried me at times, deeply. No one likes to admit it, In fact, most just avoid the thoughts. But there is a hungry power hidden within the darkness. Be it the physical world, the internal world, or the written world within one's imagination. More than once in one of our many conversations after hanging up, I would question if David was slipping away in little slivers, maybe struggling a bit without calling out for help as he treaded the dark waters of his mind. There I go, thinking in the flowery internal language of a writer. I remember he used to goad me about the lack of ability to turn the writer's spigot off. I smiled briefly before his absence was announced to me again in the quiet sniffles from mourners in pain. More tears slid down Magpie's cheeks. Her little face was so contorted in sadness. "Oh, sweetie, I know you will miss him, but I know he misses you already," were the words I wanted to whisper to her if I were standing beside her. It was all I could do to turn away and walk back to my car, knowing not only had the world lost one of the good guys who could provoke deep thought, but that sweet little girl had lost her hero, her savior, the grandfather who, along with his loving wife, had rescued her from the darkness of her mommy's poor choices. Now only memories were left that would eventually fade in time until nothing but the jog of a framed photograph sitting on the mantel or a table would bring. It, of course, would then be a watered-down recollection of what he had once been to her. Damn, I should just shut my mind off. I'm depressing the hell out of myself even more than the reason I'm back in this little town who thought it was big. Springfield.
Grandma, why did Grandpa die? Is he with my mommy now?
Maggie asked as she dragged her free hand across her eyes again to clear the stinging tears away. Oh, honey, I know this is so hard to understand. Life is hardly ever fair. I'm not sure how to answer that question, Magpie. Just know that your grandpa loves you more than all the stars in the sky. And now that he lives up amongst them, she wiped her tears back slowly with her finger. Just know that he is always in our hearts and also looking down on us with loving eyes, wishing he could hold you in one of your squeezy hugs, Coraline answered as she pulled her little granddaughter tightly into her side and squeezed.
And I love him more than all the grains of sand on every beach in the world, Grandma. And I always will. Please promise me I won't forget about him.
Magpie tried to be brave, but when you lose your favorite grandpa in the world at the early age of 8, it just doesn't seem to make sense. And there is rarely a way to make it do just that ever again. Would some ice cream help, Magpie? Grandma asked. Her little face looked up as if she was trying to contemplate her answer. She then suddenly shook her head no and spoke softly.
It just wouldn't taste sweet today, Grandma. I think I'd rather go home and be sat in Grandpa's chair. I think I'm just supposed to think about him today. That's all.
Coraline held her sweet little granddaughter's hand tightly as they made their way back to the car. Coraline watched from the corner of her eye and noticed Magpie steal a last glimpse of her grandpa's spot under the tent in the cemetery. She couldn't hold back the tears, and they overpowered her battle to squelch them like a big girl might. In between erratic sobs, she asked,
Can we come back again to visit Grandpa, please? I don't want him to be here alone with all the other dead people in the ground. I think he will need to know we will come see him. A lot.
Of course, Magpie. We'll make it a regular trip. I think we both will need to visit. We'll bring a white rose when we come back. Magpie nodded in agreement as she pulled a single white petal from her pocket and clutched it tightly in her hand. The car door closed and Coraline started the engine. As she began pulling away, she too felt the need to steal one more glance back where David was put to rest, knowing the secret that no one else knew. 2. I sat in the overstuffed reading chair which sat closely to the large gas log fireplace in the hotel lobby. The heat knocked the edge off the cold evening, especially after the dreary day at the funeral service. I felt like trying to connect with my good friend David, not yet willing or ready to say goodbye. I began reading his last book, the one he had just gotten the author's proof of. It had arrived in a large manila envelope just 2 weeks earlier, and I now felt guilty I hadn't gotten around to opening it. He had told me it was his best. He had said on the phone that night, "It is so real to me that it almost scares the bejesus out of me. Is that bizarre or what?" He snickered afterwards, so I'd not taken him seriously. I now wish I had. Woulda, coulda, shoulda, I thought to myself. I continued reading, but then after a chapter, I pushed the book forward in my lap and folded it closed. I held my finger between the pages where I'd stopped reading. I suddenly needed to see the front cover again. Shaking my head after studying it, I was amazed of how well it portrayed the feeling I was getting from its words written within. The story was powerful from the very start. It was foreboding and chilling. David had seemed to always own a knack to suck the reader into his story's surroundings. Usually, the front covers he created painted that visual picture very clearly. A picture paints 1,000 words. Well, David used both equally well. It was usually almost uncanny, as this one certainly was. It was as if each book he had published was truly a macabre twist of his own personal story he was telling. He was so in tune with the entire process. But no one could survive if they were surrounded by all the dark thoughts that his books provoked. The title for this novel was telling enough if you knew David at all. Titled, Never Cage a Magpie by D.D. Duvain. Yes, David Duncan Duvain was a born weaver of tales. The story was about a young woman growing up in Kimmswick, Missouri, a little town along the banks of the Mississippi River. A wholesome little town that also held its share of dark secrets, as many small towns do. The young woman had gotten tangled up in the drug world and just dropped her daughter off one day at her parents', never to return or see them or her daughter again. As I read this story, it was obvious to me that it was at least loosely based on the dark secrets of his daughter's exploits. I couldn't tell for sure which parts were true and which were enhanced to make the story's fiction even more provocative. It was heart-wrenching, though. I knew he himself held deep pain he rarely shared aloud. As I looked at the artwork on the cover, a shadowy silhouette of a young woman with a caged bird in the foreground, I could feel his personal grief. The cover was in dark blacks and grays with a stark blinding white. The title stood out in subdued crimson red, the font slashed in as if tearing from the page like fingernails through skin. It was very grabbing and immediately drew an emotion of fear within. The cover alone would draw a reader of dark fiction to immediately pick it up. David always liked to twist a dark undertone into everyday humanity and emotions. Instead of always focusing on the silver lining as some writers do, he would draw out the bleak pain and then carefully mix it with fading hope, but enough warmth to keep you hoping for an outcome that you could live with. His stories toyed with the reader in ways that would make one nervous of what might happen on the next page. Would it be something lovely and touching, or would you be instantly reeled in to be shred to pieces with shock and rebuke? You wanted to turn the page to investigate on the one hand, but on the other, the thought brought great apprehension and toil. A roller coaster ride you were unable to climb out of the strapped-in seat until it came to a screeching and sudden halt called the end. His books always stuck with me for long periods of time after finishing them. I would lay in bed trying to sleep, but instead would find myself reasoning with the characters and their choices as if I could convince them to reconsider and have a different outcome. As I reopened this book and began reading every word more carefully, I again became sucked back into the quagmire I now feared was his real world being displayed on paper. My heart suddenly went out to David. There isn't any way he couldn't have been tormented within. Was he writing books like this to aid his escape from the pain? Or was this the poison that enabled his darkness to overtake him, even feed him? Would anyone ever know that answer now? Did I truly ever know David like I had always assumed I did all these years? I immediately thought about Magpie. I wondered if she was okay tonight. My heart suddenly broke. She had lost her mother already only a short time back. That most certainly was devastating, especially in the way she was dropped off at David and Coraline's. Brandy, her mother, telling her she'd see her soon, but then disappearing into a life of choosing to stay away. And now out of nowhere, it seemed. David, crashing his car off the bridge into that cold, deep lake. Of course, Magpie certainly wasn't given the details, but nonetheless, David is gone and never to return. I felt sorry for Coraline. I couldn't imagine what it was like in her home tonight. The whole thing seemed crazy and so abrupt. The oddity of it was that as I read on in his new yet unpublished book, I felt I was reading the script of what was to come in his real life. It was as if he already knew ahead of time and created this novel to tell the story once he was gone. Part of me couldn't read the words quick enough to find out what happened, as if I were a private investigator that had stumbled onto a hidden treasure trove of evidence. Of course, the other part wanted to throw the book down and never pick it up again, instead choosing to remember my friend as he once was before this tragedy robbed him from our world. God damn you, David, for not reaching out before leaving me with this quandary of what to do now that you're gone. I, of course, succumbed and turned the page to continue. Immediately drawn back in, I knew deep inside there never was any other choice to make. I'd been fooling myself to think there ever was. 3.
But I saw him, Grandma. Grandpa was with me, and I read him a book.
Magpie cried out. Her body shook as the tears flowed. Oh, honey, it was a dream, sweetie. I'm not surprised you would dream about him. Coraline rubbed Maggie's back to try and calm her.
I love you, Grandma, but I want my mommy and my grandpa too.
I know you do, Magpie. I do too, sweetie. Do you want me to crawl into your bed and snuggle?
You're not going to leave me too, are you?
She asked her grandma, her eyes staring intently into her Coraline's. Coraline crawled under the covers and spooned with her granddaughter. No, sweet Magpie, I'm not ever going to leave you. You're stuck with me, like glue. She forced a giggle from the hollowness she really felt to help comfort Maggie. She knew the nights were going to be rough for quite a while. Tonight was horribly difficult for her. She couldn't imagine what it was like for Magpie. She rubbed Maggie's back softly and quietly assured her everything was going to be all right. Am I really telling her this to make her feel better? Or am I trying to convince myself? I hadn't been alone since meeting David in Hawaii. What, 25 years ago? Oh, David, these dark angels inside of you. Why didn't you let me know of your struggles? The moment she heard tiny snores of Magpie, Coraline broke down and fought back the heaves her body beckoned. Heavy, salted tears flowed and burned her eyes. Damn it, David. I need you. I can't do this alone. Why did you have to dive so deep into your darkness? Life can be funny in a frightful sort of way, like when you truly feel like you are drowning under the total weight of the ocean. You're fighting to squeeze that one last breath into your lungs, giving you just one more minute of life. But then suddenly something snaps, and you find yourself treading that same water, except now you feel almost comfortable. Your head once again above the rough water's surface, you feel safe. That memory of the harsh and scary moments just seconds ago quickly fade into a distant past. You instantly forget the paralyzing pain that had just held you captive in fear. Yet you always remain cognizant of the struggle hovering overhead. This is everyday life suffering with depression and anxiety. Coraline woke up and sensed she had been with David. She knew it was impossible, but when there was movement in the bed beside her, she quickly turned, almost expecting to see him lying next to her. She instead found Maggie. The warm feeling of imagining it was David lying next to her did not, however, dissipate. She tried to hang on to the sensation if she could. Her granddaughter's overheated young body was the source of comfort which helped feed her ability to maintain this moment of thought. Coraline instantly felt as if she would be able to continue and even grow her life back to a sense of normalcy. She felt David somehow gave her that miraculous feeling of instant confidence, even though he wasn't here. He was still inside her heart and helping her steer the bow of their ship into the direction needed. She'd have to keep convincing their little Magpie, but she felt a sense of conviction that was not there yesterday. Maggie woke up and surprisingly, her mood wasn't full of the sadness or distress it had been at bedtime last night. Her first words surprised Coraline.
Grandma, why do you and Grandpa and others like Connor call me Magpie? I've always wondered, but today I just feel like I'm supposed to ask. Weird, huh?
She asked. Well, Maggie, what is your favorite thing to do?
Oh, come on, Grandma. Don't you even know that? Singing, of course. I love to sing, silly.
Maggie answered. That's right. And guess what magpie birds enjoy doing? Coraline asked.
Sing?
Maggie asked. Yes, indeed. And that is why your grandpa started calling you Magpie as a little girl. You've always loved to sing, and your voice is as beautiful as any songbirds. Magpies are also the only known birds that can recognize themselves in a mirror. Don't ask me how they know that, but Lord knows you spend enough time in front of the mirror to recognize yourself too. Magpies are also one of the smartest and cleverest of birds. Sound familiar? Coraline chuckled.
Plus,
Maggie smiled with the grin of knowing.
Magpie starts with the same 3 letters as my name, Maggie. M-A-G.
Indeed it does, Coraline retorted. Magpie's bright green eyes suddenly dimmed. A tear began to poke out from under each eyelid. Before they had time to slide down her cheeks, she ran and was in her grandmother's arms.
I want my grandpa back. I don't want him to have to be in that hole in the ground. I don't want him to be dead anymore. And I just know he's so scared and lonely without us.
We'll go today to check, Magpie. Coraline knew she couldn't cave and start something that may impede her healing, but she was weak. We can't do this every day, but I think today is appropriate. 4. The phone rang and Coraline got up to answer it. Hello? Oh, hello, Connor. It's good to hear your voice. Do you have a moment? He asked. I suppose. What's on your mind? Have you read David's last book, Cora? There was a brief silence on the line. Well, I didn't know you even had copies of it yet. And I'm sure you know that his later books are not really something I enjoy reading. Too much of the dark side of life. I know, Coraline, but he had sent me an author's proof a couple of days before I'm sorry, I hate to bring anything up, but this book, this is very strange. What do you mean, Connor? Strange like how? I can't explain it over the phone. Can we get together sometime soon, before I have to head back to Seward? And Magpie, how is she? Moody and teary-eyed one moment, and then almost normal the next. So, you've not seen the cover either? Or the title of this book? Connor inquired. No. Why are you being so surreptitious about this book? Coraline, it's a story foretelling events. Real events. Things in life that led up to... Connor cleared his throat twice. His accident or act. Even the title is... well, it's just odd. Okay, Connor, you are kind of freaking me out. I'm not sure I'm ready for this. I know. I got it out last night to look at. I felt bad that I hadn't gotten around to read even a line before, I was wanting to feel some closeness to him or maybe get some closure. He cleared his throat again and coughed slightly. I started reading it, and as I did, I wanted to stop and put it down, but I couldn't make myself. Okay, Connor, what's the title that is so odd? Never Cage a Magpie. What? Coraline asked in an almost agitated tone. Why would he title it after Maggie? She followed with a growing defensive manner. I know, not like his usual thriller titles. It's why I asked. So, you haven't seen the cover artwork either? No, and I'm afraid to ask now, she answered. There was a hush over the line. The seconds drew by. Connor? Magpie can't hear about any of this. Almost cutting Connor off, Coraline answered very defensively. I know, Connor. This may be my first time alone for a long while, but it's not my first rodeo with my granddaughter. I know what to keep her away from. I'm sorry, Coraline. I'm just a little wigged out. I've been up reading almost all night trying to finish the book. It's definitely no book for a child. It's like drawing me in as if I'm a cop trying to solve a crime. We need to talk. I'm leaving this Friday. Okay. 5. Never Cage a Magpie, Chapter 38. The dark angels are surrounding me again. They pull and tear at me as if I were a piece of dead animal lying flattened alongside the road. The turkey vultures quibbling over which gets the tasty brain meat and who gets stuck with the skimpy veiny bones. Of course, the pain's already dulled by the truck which ran me over, but the pulling and tugging of the stringed muscle and tendons does indeed cause intense distress. It's like the not knowing of where my daughter Whitney is. She's gone and I realize it. That pain was devastating until the time passed ushering in the numbness, but there is the occasional snippet of information on where she was seen, friends telling me of her looks of despair, her dropping off a birthday gift for Magpie, the blurred image of her placing the small gift on the front porch at 1 a.m., lessening her chance of seeing us. Instead, only being caught by the Ring camera, expecting us to deliver those gifts so we can watch her daughter become broken again. Another crushing lie explaining why her mommy is mentally damaged but still loves her. Knowing it's not enough of an answer to heal the wound reopened. These kinds of things are like the tearing of the dead flesh, the skin that died from the initial loss but still clings to the nerve endings for endless pangs of reminding hurt, doled out at their sick daughter's drug-induced whims. It's not fair. It's not fair to hold these things, these happenings, these pitfalls of life. It's as if Whitney were trying to cage her daughter, our sweet little Magpie, and she's forced me to be the wire bars of the cell holding her. Who released these dark angels upon me, Lord? The gnashing of my teeth and the weeping of my soul and eyes. How long will I be able to keep up the good fight against the dark thoughts? The haunting seems never ending, my world void of any light in front or behind me. I reach out to touch something, hoping to feel the warmth of another soul, one untainted by these evil winged monsters of mental anguish. But all I ever find is the harsh cold bleakness of stone, unending and without hope. It feels as if I too am caged, my bars twisted and formed by my own fears and hurt. The cage I made that I'm housed in faces the cage our daughter created that holds our Magpie. And as I squint to try to make out her image through the dimness of the prison's yard, I notice Magpie's cage door hangs open and free to exit. But she is too frightened to attempt flight from her captivity. No mother to nudge her from the nest, likely not understanding she could escape if only. But where would she fly off to in such a dark and dank world void of love? I'm near her and want to hold her close to give comfort, but she can't see from the blanket of black tossed over her by her mother, hiding her daughter from her own sight, aiding as cover from her goddamned guilt of caring more about the drug fix than the dependent life she brought into this quagmire. Damn you for laying what you see as this troublesome boulder upon my shoulders. I'm not the Samson you saw me as. I'm weak and tired, and sometimes I feel the draw to the edge of the bridge that crosses the cold waters of eternal escape. Goliath calls my name in a mocking voice of a beautiful nymph or siren, tempting me to trust that those lustful cries will forever settle my constant torment this hellish world dealt me. I would beg to be allowed to surrender, but by doing so, the internal shame would be exposed for all to take notice and judge my weakness. That's right, goddammit. Pride is the strong root of the evil that drags me downward into the depths. Coraline's eyes were wet pools of overflowing tears. Her sobs weighted with the heaviness of granite. Her body heaved in waves of broken pain. I attempted comfort, but how helpful is a freshly broken cup to carry the warm consolatory elixir to another's suffering? All I could do was say, I'm sorry, Coraline, but But you see why I had to meet with you, don't you? This cover, these words. Coraline looked deep into my eyes with almost a child's questioning eyes, begging for answers I had no possession of. Why did he write this, Connor? Why? It's pain and evil and devastation. Did he really feel like this? Why couldn't he tell me? Or you? You were his best friend, for God's sake. You didn't see this coming? Or talk about any of this when you met every week? Did he intentionally drive off that fucking bridge? Is this what this is saying? How could I not see he was dying inside? I'm sorry, Coraline. I had no idea either. I didn't know he was so riven and splintered. As I read his book, I found myself constantly beating myself up for not seeing any of these signs. I'm a blind fool and a failed friend. My head dropped and I covered my tear-filled eyes, keeping Coraline from seeing them. I've canceled my flight home for now. I want to be here for you as long as you and Magpie need me. 6. I laid the book down on the table, face down as I couldn't look again at the image it held. I was empty. The goddamn book had been like a magnet drawn to me as if I were steel. I felt like each word from that book cut deep and tugged one more tidbit of mental flesh from my brain. As painful as it read, and as telling of the hidden turmoil as it was, David was right. It was powerful and his best writing. I couldn't imagine another author having written something with more potency within to tug at the reader's heart. His book had left me totally worn, ragged, and scarred, figuratively gasping in a pile on the floor after being run through with his written word sword, writhing in its aftermath. I didn't believe I could read another book of David's after reading this one. Even if he were still alive and writing, I wouldn't be able to understand the need. Once the last word of this book ran across my sensory mechanism and I'd closed it between my hands, I felt I'd been drawn and quartered. Fini. Coraline and I both now understood the world David had found himself helplessly trapped within. We had found it together, helping each other through the process. I think we both somehow even accepted the reasons he had kept such a world hidden from us. I think it was his way of protecting us from it. His final book being his way of warning us about the dark world's existence within the normal one most of us live. We both discussed what good would really come from publishing this final work of his. Did she really want this to be David's legacy left behind? We both agreed that this story, no matter how brilliant the superlatives were, was far too personal a story to be told to just anyone who could purchase it. It was dangerous in a way, hurtful. It had already been told to the two it was meant for, and should never be released to be exploited and misunderstood. Coraline then informed me of her little secret that she had kept from the world. She hadn't had David's body cremated for a reason. She told me it was because David's body may have not been recovered. There was a body found within the car, no doubt, but she believed it wasn't David's. She hadn't told the authorities because they already assumed it was. They never tested the DNA or dental work. But there was jewelry on his body that wasn't his. A necklace. One she had never seen before. She needed the option of future testing in case another body was ever found. She knew it sounded crazy, but once she had kept quiet at first, she felt unable to say anything different. And so, this part of his death had become a dark secret she would have to live with. It also gave her the mental gift of highest hope that one day David would show back up and rescue her and Magpie again as he had helped rescue her once before. It was her one and only hope at this point, and she couldn't give that tinge of hope up yet. On the day before I was to leave for my return trip to Seward, Alaska, Coraline and I set out to complete our final act in saying goodbye to David. It was a quiet and sad trip down Highway 13 to the bridge across Table Rock Lake. It reached out across the deepest waters immediately south of Kimberling City. We parked and walked midway, finding the welded repaired spot where David's car had broken through the side railing before crashing into the cold lake some 40 feet below to the waterline. The moon was full and traffic was non-existent. In fact, it was downright eerie and unearthly. We both shed tears while holding hands as we said our goodbyes to a man who had played very important roles in each of our lives. He had made his mark on many people, both friends and fans. I believe both of us felt somewhat guilty that we had decided not to make his final work available to them. But while it is against every fiber in my being to censor or burn any form of writing, I couldn't allow his final legacy be a dark, dirty smear of comparisons to his memory and how he likely chose to leave this world. As the clouds drifted between us and the moon darkened the moment even more, I looked over to Coraline for the nod and then dropped the only known copy of Never Cage a Magpie over the edge of the railing. We both stood quietly as we waited to hear the faint splash of its bound pages connect with the watery surface, knowing it would sink almost 200 feet below to the silted bottom of the frigid dark tomb that more than likely also encased the man that penned it. It was done, the act over, the goodbyes given, and the prayers of forgiveness completed. Fini. Coraline and I walked hand in hand back to the parked car where we climbed in, now sheltered from the cold night air, and drove home in silence. Coraline and Magpie would drive me to the airport in the morning. Coraline was gracious enough to let me stay in their home on my final night before departing back to Alaska. We played games and worked on a puzzle together. Magpie looked as if she were accepting the new world she was now living without her Grandpa David or Mommy Brandy. She loved her Grandma Coraline, and the two of them would be fine. I could see it in their eyes. Strong survivors had been born from this tragedy.
Uncle Connor, when are you going to come visit me and Grandma again? You aren't going to wait until somebody dies, are you?
No, Magpie, I won't wait until that happens, I promise. In fact, I've invited your grandma and you to come visit me in Seward, Alaska this July. Does that sound like fun?
Brr, it sounds cool, but I'll bring my heaviest coat. Will I get to see bears and mooses?
I'll see what I can do, sweet Magpie. At the airport terminal, Magpie pushed my rolling suitcase until it was to the point they could go no further with me to the gate. I reached over to Coraline and drew her into my arms and whispered, "Let's talk at least every other night. I want to make sure you two are good, and I'll be looking forward to showing you around Alaska this summer. I hope you stay as long as you like." I gave her a peck on her cheek and pulled back to see a warm gleam in her eyes. My heart felt strangely warm in that instant. I brushed the feeling to the side as I then turned and bent down on one knee to face Magpie. "Can I have one of those big squeeze hugs you used to give away all the time? I really miss those." She wrapped both arms around me as far as she could and made her huggy noise as she squeezed me tightly.
Ooh, I love you, Uncle Connor. I better give you two, so they will last till your plane lands.
You take good care of your grandma, Magpie. I'm counting on you. I pulled back and winked at her. Magpie leaned back in close and whispered in my ear,
I will. I'll take the bestest care of her. Do you think you might ever marry my grandma, so you can be my grandpa? It would make it easier not to cry so much. And I know my Grandpa David wouldn't be mad.
An instant pain struck, much like I imagined a needle piercing my heart would feel. Would that really help make you happy, sweetie?
Yes, sir. It sure would. I know she likes you.
Well, Magpie, we'll see how she feels in July. How about that? I smiled at her and then looked up and smiled at Coraline. See you two in July and talk to you when I land. When I opened the door to my home in Seward, I almost tripped over the pile of mail that had been poked through the mail slot in the front door. The first thing that caught my eye was a manila envelope laying on top. My heart raced and prickles rushed throughout my body in broad shivers. I bent down to pick it up, holding it close to my face to read whatever was written on the outside. It was like deja vu as I began to tear the edge open after not finding a return address on it anywhere. My fingers still chilled from the frigid air outside. I pulled the opening of the envelope wide enough to see a book. I walked over to my kitchen bar and spilled the contents onto the marble top. My eyes surely stood out as huge white orbs as a look of shock certainly washed over me. There was a picture of David on the back cover. It was blurred, with part of the image crystal clear. Hanging from his neck was a small silver necklace. Dangling from its chain were 2 charms. One was what looked like a bird in opened wing flight. The other, a bird cage with the door swung open. I couldn't help but wonder if there was an intended meaning with the predominant necklace in the clear part of the photo, while the upper part, his eyes, appeared blurred. The memory of Coraline speaking of a necklace found on the body, a necklace she didn't recognize, suddenly overwhelmed my brain. Quickly scanning the written book blurb, I took a deep breath before flipping the author's copy over to display the front cover and title. And there it was, bigger than life, a new novel with the letters D.D. Duvain boldly stamped across the bottom. My eyes traveled upward, looking for the title, my eyesight shooting past the graphics for now. "Oh my God," I spoke aloud. "What the hell have you done, David?" In bright iridescent blue, the color of a magpie's prominent stripe on its wing, was bold lettering. The font was less intimidating than the earlier books. The title didn't stir the same tension within. In fact, it was almost comforting and calming. The Healing of Magpie was emboldened over a beautiful young girl's soft-toned face. She looked a lot like Maggie May Duvain. In the background was the open door on a bird cage. The image of a bird soaring in free flight high above in the white clouds, fading into a bright-colored sunset over the water's horizon. This cover was as different from his last book as darkness is to daylight. I stood dumbfounded. I left my suitcase dumped alongside the rest of my piled mail and walked with David's book in my warming hands over to my reading chair. I turned up the heat on the gas log and flipped my reading light to its brightest setting, then sat down. I was mesmerized as I read a handwritten comment on the inside title page. "To my best friend in this world, Connor, I know you have more than likely suffered a gamut of emotions at my causing. Everything from wonder to frustration, love, anger to hate, and most everything in between. You know I've always enjoyed toying with people's emotions, and yours would be included. I can't tell you where I am or what happened. You will assume, but I can neither confirm nor deny if I'm alive or stuck in a world running parallel to such a reality. I just know I am healed. I have no anxiety within or fears of what will happen next. My clouds have shaken the darkness and transformed into white. I now know in the end all will be well, and that is a comfort I've not been afforded for quite some time. Please take care of Coraline and Magpie as if they are now yours. You have my blessing. In fact, it is my request that if you can love them better than I, that you should do just that. You, my friend, are like the brother I lost too early in life and have forever longed for. I love you, brother. David. P.S. A fitting poem by an unknown author. It's an old nursery rhyme about magpies. 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for a girl, and 4 for a boy, 5 for silver, 6 for gold, 7 for a secret never to be told. You have my blessing to let Coraline in on our little secret. I imagine this is a much more fitting book for her to enjoy than my last several. Someday, when the timing is right, please let my little magpie know this secret too, and tell her I was always nearby, watching and loving her the entire time. I'm so sorry her mommy was so sick and pitiful. Please try to explain to her that that is indeed what she was, mentally sick and broken beyond repair. I shared my little magpie's pain from the loss of Brandy also. We can't make people change or live like we want them to, no matter how much we love them and them to do so. I finally accepted that I did my best to save her, and there was nothing more that could be done. One must want to save themselves and not expect others to do so. She did love her little Magpie, though. I will always believe that. Brandy just didn't know how to walk the tight wire that was her path to a happy ending for all involved. I hope you enjoy the read, my good friend. Know that I've turned over a new leaf. The darkness has subsided into light, and the pain into a comforting happiness with contentment. My only regret is being separated from my dear family I love so much. And you, my dear friend, please help make them understand none of this was them. Even though I feel healed, that long path of brokenness never fully heals enough to know if you go back, you will survive any better. Understand, the leaving is not so dark and foreboding as the living can be. David. I sank down into the chair cushion, prepared for a long evening of reading. I turned page after page, amazed as usual, but in a much different flavor. Instead of dreading each page turn, fearing where the story may lead, I felt invigorated by each turn, almost racing to the next, feeling warmer within. My good friend was alive and back in a world filled with happiness and joy, even if he wasn't truly alive. I supposed I had never known for certain. This entire event was such a hard concept for me to get a grip on, but the hours passed as the chapters rolled on. I had not read through too many books in such a short time without a break. This one felt like I could start back at the beginning and never lose interest rereading it back to back immediately. Instead, though, I reached for my phone and dialed Coraline. She answered on the second ring, and I could hear Magpie's happy voice calling out,
Uncle Connor, I miss you, I love you, and I'm already ready to come freeze with you.
Me too, Magpie. Me too. I smiled briefly to myself, warm goosebumps invading my skin from head to toe. Coraline? Honey? You won't believe what David has done. Have I got a story for you?
My name's Skip Richards. I'm a newspaper man with a local rag up here in Northern Cali, and I'd been sussing out possible leads for my next big story. It needed to be something local, with a lot of pathos and plenty of surprises to keep 'em turning the page. I'd stumbled on a guy who was a detective, some kind of spook doctor from the sounds of it. I'd figured I'd interview him, see which direction it took. He could turn out to be nothing but a nut job. There's plenty of colorful misfits around here. But if there really was something I could sink my teeth into, I'd milk it for all it was good for. It happened like this. I'd been dug in at a nearby watering hole, a nice enough place, dark and airy with a lot of windows and a long deck out back hugging the rocks overlooking the Pacific's crashing waves below. And it was casual enough so nobody's hanging over your shoulder making sure the tab's still growing. The place dished up the usual grub, steaks, heavy on the fish, chowder, and burgers, and also served as the local chapter of the Crusty Old Farts Club. When I frequented the joint, it was mostly just the same weather-beaten old codgers. Fishermen, the same you'd see all over the world, jacks of all trade for whatever needed getting done, and the kind of retirees who'd eye you up and down with a sneer, and then talk your ear off once they figured you were all right. Sooner or later, their curiosity gets the best of them, and they always talk to a newspaper man. I'd started sounding them out on what was doing around here, who was the man to know, any weirdos or crackpots to avoid, who to call when you needed a job done, wood hauling, something fixed, that sort of thing. They all agreed a guy hunkered down in the corner nursing his drink was just the fella I was looking for.
Name's Henderson, Jack Henderson,
one old coot said, stabbing his thumb over his shoulder towards the guy and tugging the snow-white beard he'd never seemed to let go of.
Yeah, he's your man, sure to rights. You go talk to Jack. He's an okay sort. He likes to jaw when you get him started. Don't expect too much at first, though. You won't get anything out of him tonight, that's for damn sure.
Another said with a snort of laughter.
No, sir. That's the truth. You gotta be patient with a fella like that. Let him see you around, then go nice and easy, like you was trying to saddle break a young filly.
They all roared and slapped me on the back.
But that's the truth, though, ain't it? You mark my words. Go slow. Let 'em see you're all right, and he'll lay some yarns on you you'll not soon forget. That's for damn sure,
he added as they all got up and staggered towards the dartboard. That was the last I had out of them, but I could hear them well enough from where I sat.
You taking the Lucy Linda out like you planned, Stu?
One of them asked, never taking his eye off his aim.
You bet. Got a group of rich young bucks coming up from Frisco. Want me to take 'em out for Marlin, don't you know?
Stu boomed and they all roared.
Marlin? What a bunch of half-wits. Don't they know it's too damn cold around here for Marlin?
Another piped up.
No, they do not, sir. And I will oblige you to stay mum on those particulars and keep your damn yap to yourself. You got any idea what they'll be kicking my way for a half-day trip like that?
He grumbled.
Don't blame 'em, though, Marlins. She's a damn good-looking fish, all right,
said another, taking aim at the dartboard.
Hell yeah, it is. I figure they want one of them beauties to hang up over their desk to impress their friends.
And with this, they all broke up into laughter again, and I spied the guy who they had pointed out as Jack Henderson look up and tap the side of his skull and shoot a grin in my direction. I did the same and asked him what he was drinking. I grabbed it and made my way with a beer of my own to his table and introduced myself. Lucky for me, we hit it off right away. Both had spent time up in New York and up in the Klondike, so there was plenty for me to open with. And he kept raising me like he'd been itching for somebody new to talk to. I've always had an open mind when it comes to anything that takes me off the beaten path. But all too soon, we were shaking hands and headed to our cars, agreeing to do this again sometime real soon. I hadn't pushed them, but left a few openers where it was clear I was looking for a good story. The weirder the better, and I was none too judgmental on such things. I could always back out later if the guy turned out to be a crank, but I had a gut feeling he wasn't. It was just 2 nights later when we happened to be back in the schooner nursing drinks over dinner, and Jack was asking me more about my story.
There's plenty enough to work with around here,
Jack said, sawing through a steak that was bleeding red and running across his plate.
Scratch the surface and everybody around here is a real character. These old guys,
he said, pointing to the crew clustered around the dartboard.
They're a pack of misfit rodeo clowns, but they're all right. I suppose they told you I was a detective?
He said, eyeing me over the top of his glasses. Yeah, I believe they did. You with Gualala PD? I asked, playing dumb, and he snorted.
Is that what they told you?
He asked incredulously, not sure if I was pulling his leg or the old boys were having me on. I don't remember exactly. So what is it anyway? Could make for an interesting line on my story. I bet you've got some real humdingers to tell. I prodded, hunkering down and signaling another round from the bar. Noticing the old guys had simmered down and were pulling their chairs up to grab an earful and make sure they didn't miss a single word.
Here's my card,
Jack said, pulling one from his jacket pocket and shoving it at me across the table.
What do you think that means?
He asked, tapping the small white card with a finger and eyeing me closely. Don't let the haints get you. Called Jack, I read slowly. Well, I'm not sure exactly. Haints. That's ghosts and devil stuff, right? I said, knowing full well what it was.
Close enough, Mr. Newspaper Man, close enough. Now, I've handled a lot of cases in my time and seen things that would get me tossed into the nuthatch if I opened my yap to the wrong people. You bet I've seen things. Rubbed shoulders and more with all kind of conjure folk, medicine men, whammy mambos, and witch doctors the world over. But I do have one little story I can slap on the table to wet your whistle if you like. And as I say, make of it what you will,
he said, tossing off the last of his drink. Hell yeah, that'd be swell. And I gotta tell you, I've got an open mind and don't recommend anybody to the loony bin who's not running naked in the street, I said, and Henderson busted a belly laugh and fixed me with his gaze as he gathered his thoughts.
Alrighty then. This was a couple of years back now, so all cards are on the table. I admit to handling cases that would get most people slammed into that loony bin of yours. Truth be told, I did a stint there myself when I was a lot younger and a whole lot stupider than I am now. You learn quick enough if you want to stay above ground and passable for sane. Who to tell what and when to hold your lip. When you keep your cards to yourself, when to call, and most importantly, when it's your time to walk the hell away. There's no shame in walking away if you can't win in some haint's game, and no honor in dying. I'm still working it all out, but it's all worked out well enough,
Henderson explained, pausing long enough to see whether I was giving him the hairy eyeball or not.
So this couple got a hold of me, like I say, a couple years back. Said they'd moved into a house that was by all rights haunted, and they had about had all they could stand and wanted to see if it could be exorcised or something. I was about to walk away from that one. Talk of exorcisms and the like reeks to me of Bibles and God-botherers, and mumbo-jumbo that doesn't mean a damn thing by my reckoning. And haints, ghosts, and such, all the rest of it, hell, the great by and by is filled to the rafters with folks and critters and whatnots that don't fall into any category by rights, and talk of exorcisms just gets my hackles up. But wanting to be polite and all, I asked them what they had seen and heard, how they knew it was haunted, and most importantly, how did the place feel? They said it felt evil. Not my term, theirs. So I asked them to explain. That's when they had me. They said it only happened at night, but it was kids. They heard a lot of little feet tearing ass through the house all night, and crying in hushed whispers. Well, I had heard enough. First off, little kids ain't evil. I mean, sure, there's exceptions, but they're mighty rare. But I'll never turn down a case where there's kids involved. That gets my backside up, and I'll go to war to help them any way I can. Send them on to the promised land, or wherever they go if they had a mind to choose. So it was all settled. The couple, the Smiths we'll call them, moved into a hotel and left me the place for the duration of whatever I needed to do. I packed a few bags of what I'd need to suss the place out. I brought the cards, of course, along with an assortment of shimmy wands and juju ciphers and gadgets I'd picked up from all over for drawing stuff out of the walls and whatever hidey holes they were shored up in. I brought my coyote shade, too, for walking between the spaces and seeing what there was to be seen, but only if I really needed to. I brought a number of small clay pots full of concoctions my buddy Christopher down in New Orleans kept me supplied with for a variety of needs. And I brought a shiny black calling card with the Baron Samedi's Veve worked into it in quick silver that flows over the surface like water, never looking the same way twice. I kept that in a case for safekeeping, safe for it and safe for me. That thing was for special occasions only, and I did not use it lightly. Just having it on me had a price attached, but it was damn indispensable for when things got too far out of reach of my usual line. Let's pull up to the fire,
Jack said.
Fog's coming in fast. It'll be cold as a bastard in here. Okay, so first thing I had to do was scope out the house during the day and get the feel of it, since the Smith said the action only started up at night. I figured the place wouldn't really feel evil if it was just a couple of little kid haints running around. But, well, there's a reason you got kids haunting the place, and it always starts with some kind of tragedy that needs to get set to rights. So I set up camp in that big old house. Not a mansion, but a right fine brick middle-class home from the turn of the century with a huge living room, stone fireplace a man could walk into, and a dining room big enough to seat 20 people or more, and a kitchen needed to pull it off. There was lots of bedrooms, too, nothing fancy, all pretty run-of-the-mill with the Smiths remodeling and all. I wandered through the place, letting it sink in and take hold of me. Not thinking too hard on anything, really, just listening as the walls talked to me, if they had a mind to. Nothing much came to me on that first pass, so I dumped my gear in a room I liked for bunking in. Then I plundered the well-stocked icebox, setting a roaring fire, and settled down to open myself all the way, and wait for the preliminary fireworks that was bound to come. My unapologetic presence being a glove thrown to the barroom floor, so to speak. A confused torrent of waves washed over me. There was kids here all right, 2 of them, a boy and a girl, and something else. It was this something else that caught my attention, and it causing all the hurt that was going on here. I did a reading of the cards, yeah. The spirits of the children were inhabiting this place, and no, they were not happy little tykes. How could they be, trapped in here by none of their own doing? I decided to doze off for a bit and see if I could spy anything through that side of things. I woke up suddenly with a jerk as something gave my hand a strong yank, and I almost fell out of my chair. I could hear the little footsteps retreating down the hall, and lots of whispering. No games here. I was clearly being sized up. Who was I, and what hand was I going to play in all this? I got up and walked around the room, taking my time, letting my guard down nice and easy like I'd do with a pooch I was hoping to make pals with. The kids could see I meant them no harm, and I could feel their eyes on me, watching, tucked away in their hidey holes, places they'd long made use of. Then I felt the other eyes on me, furtive, suspicious, old and mean, and the source of all the terror that was coming off the kids in hot waves. He was sizing me up, too, from the shadows. Just how much trouble was I going to be? It didn't take long to know the kid stayed hid when the other was nosing around, and it didn't take a college egghead to know he had a hold on them, that he needed them, and that need was sick and wrong. The old man, as I started to think of him, he stayed out of sight, which is a trick in itself, but I could feel him throbbing there in the darkness like a vile heart turned to rot from years, too many years of joyful frolic and evil-doing. But I had my eye locked on him just the same. Not many can hide from old Jack Henderson when he wants 'em unhid. When he was cleaning my sights, that's when I saw he was what I like to call a twofer, meaning a human that's carrying a leech. The leech being something not human, that never was human, that gets into somebody like a parasite and turns them to rot in ways not normal to a human of decent society. See, a leech knows his business real good. Who can say what they are, really? Low order of thing, that's for sure. Like any parasite or maggot that gnaws on something and turns it to muck as the spirit of its host bleeds away to feed the leech. More people, way more people, living people, are carrying around the leech than most people could ever suspect. And it explains all kinds of stuff you read about in the newspaper. Hideous stuff of the shocking variety that makes you hold humanity in low regard. If you know what you are looking for and know how to spot it, when you meet somebody carrying a leech, you can see it like a grinning sort of thing in there behind the guy's eye, looking out at you and daring you to do something about it. And if you're a certain kind of person, you can feel it right away. No way they can hide if they're carrying a leech. When somebody dies who has a leech on them, they don't move on to the great by and by. They stay put, raising Cain and tarnation of the lowest order, as they rain down misery and hellfire on everybody in their path. I figured these kids had been the victims of the fella and the appetites of his leech when they was all alive. And when the old man died, he just kept running them like he had been. I was going to find out exactly what he had done to them, although it wasn't too hard to cipher. First, I was going to set the kids free, and then deal with the horrible old man and his leech in my own sweet time. That was the plan. The second night, I was on the watch, as I like to call it. Everybody stayed hid and just watched me go about my business. Now, since the place had been remodeled by the Smiths, I had no way of telling what the original layout was. So I called up the missus of the house, and she drove over with the blueprint so I could get a good look-see. Sure enough, there was rooms where there never was before, and other rooms were gone full missing. But what I could see plain as day was a web of energies from the kids and from the old man, and I knew he was not a relative. Not the kids' pops or granddad, nothing of the sort. As the picture got clear in my head, I could see he had been something like a butler, with the kids' folks doing way more gallivanting around than folks ought to be doing with little ones back at home. The house sat empty for years after, with some estate agents handling the sales, but nobody bit the bait for 15 years or more until the Smiths came along looking for their dream home. Talk about bum's luck. So, by way of looking for the hidey holes and secret places and boarded up rooms, I blindfolded myself so there'd be no distractions. Then, room by room, I made my way down each wall, sliding my fingertips over the surface, and sending my spotty feelers out to suss over all that was hid there. I was looking for boarded-up doors, places that didn't make sense or were out of whack with the original size of the house. Spaces too big or too small for the layout of the place. That's what I was looking for. These kinds of redos can be a big problem when the spirit of the original house lays restless like a kind of skeleton over the new configuration. If you have the right sight like I do, you can see it, like a ghost house twisted around and sitting askew over the new layout. It's one of the weirdest things I've ever seen, and as I say, sometimes it's a problem for folks, and sometimes it's not, depending on what's holed up in those lost spaces and meandering boarded-up passageways. Sure enough, I found a couple of places where a door was boarded over, painted up, and then wallpapered over. The rooms on the other side of those doors were larger in the original design. Then I set out getting a feel of the place, and right as rain, I found the kid's secret place. It was sealed over with wood and paint, and by the kind of fear that only little kids and small animals can put out when they're being hurt. I also felt the foul waves radiating like the heat you'd expect off somebody hellbound, if I was a believing man in such a place. And I found his secret place, too. It was getting on towards dark, and a biting cold was setting in, so I lit a big fire and threw up some grub, then settled down and got warm. Things being what they were, I was soon dreaming about the case, something I liked to do whenever I needed another layer of the sight. I'll pass easy into a dream, no pause or nothing, just like moving from one room to the next. What I saw there explained a lot of things, and set my mind clearly on what was going to happen next. The old man's secret room was hid all right, and had been hid when the former residents lived there too. buried over from an even earlier remodel. The thing that thrashed and slithered around in there had once been a man, but was now a full-on haint of the most despicable sort. Like I said, the butler had a leech on him, but the thing is, you don't get a leech on you unless you want him on you, or are somehow incapacitated and given over to excesses that make you easy prey. Too much bad drink and unnatural degrees of licentiousness, and I don't mean anything of the usual and ordinary variety. A fella like that is a damn magnet for anything with a hunger in it. The butler was feeding on the kids, keeping them hurt and scared like cattle to the slaughter, and just running them like an open spigot of pain. That's what was in this house, and it was a story run over several years until the kids were eventually killed in the sport this creature had a taste for. Just how much do I really need to tell you about what went on there? And how much do you need to know about a room fitted out like a damn gymnasium of horror, with tools and toys of staggering variety that even made a man like me, who's seen such things in the course of his cases, damn near disgorge his supper? There was things that had been special made, since nothing of what I saw could have been bought in any rightful legal store. There was vials of stuff, too. Oh yeah. Shelves and shelves of bottles, tinctures, mix-ups, and all the tools of the trade of a damn apothecary of evil. There was manacles on the walls, too, and on the floor, even hanging from the damn ceiling. What I saw there would put the worst of the Spanish Inquisition masterminds to howl with shame. Oh yeah. And there was books, too, and pictures of all sorts arranged and ordered up like some kind of library. I didn't look at more than enough to get the gist, but the gist was clearly meant to enhance some sort of excitation or ecstatic trance so the butler could suck the most out of what he needed from those kids. I think that's about enough. You get the picture. So as I said, this guy was a twofer, meaning there was the man thing, and there was the leech that schooled him in his ways and needs. Well, he was also a twofer in another way. By that I mean I had two cases here. One was to free the kids of this haint, and clear them of all his doings on them. The second thing that needed doing was dealing with the haint himself. Nothing like that can be allowed to run free and wreak havoc. It cannot be allowed to go forth unchecked with his account untallied, if you get my meaning.
Henderson paused here to call for another round and tossed back the one he was working on. This gave me time to reel in my chair and catch my breath. I was getting more than I'd bargained for here, and was pretty sure I was glad of it. Also pretty sure he'd given me just enough of the details without setting me up for a lifetime of nightmares, and for that I was grateful.
The next morning I woke up,
Henderson continued, getting back into his story.
Well, I just about started bawling like a baby myself. The little haints of those two kids were curled up next to me on the bed, looking for all the world like they was just fast asleep. They looked so peaceful, and it warmed me to know they'd seen me for what I was, somebody who aimed to help, who was going to protect them from further harm if he had to tear this whole damned house down to the ground with his own two hands and set the ruins ablaze. Now, don't be too disappointed if how this all gets tied up isn't a story for the ages or a cataclysm that rends the heavens asunder and the earth ablaze. The way you contain a haint, the way you send it on its way, or shut it down completely, depends on the need. A haint that was at any point a human, or even part of one, is pretty much the same the world over as the ingredients are all the same. It's a simple enough operation, but it's one of the first things you gotta learn in any of the ways of juju, conjure, and the like. So I set about to contain the kids first and get them clear of the butler and onto safe ground. There's proprietary work here, you know, sayings and the like. Designs on the floor and in the air and on my person. Oh yeah, All that and a whole lot more. That's all I'll say, as I don't want my means and methods getting out there and about. But I'm sure you can cipher my meaning here. Use your imagination.
He said with a wink, and I just nodded.
I set up in the biggest room downstairs with all my gadgets and gizmos, protecting devices both subtle and mundane. After cleaning and clearing the place, I laid out the circle of ciphers and symbols drawn up for the purpose, and lit some herbs alight in the small brazier pot I carry for such things in my kit bag. Last thing was I lit the circle ablaze and set to on the sayings I'd drawn up and knew by heart for this operation, this time drawn upon the Tibetan school who's particularly well versed in these matters. The kids came running right away into my arms, in the safety of the fiery circle I'd laid down. Of course, it didn't take long for the butler Hank to come a-running too. He slammed into the circle like an old Ford into a brick wall, and came to a dead halt, his howls of outrage and pain washing over us like a hailstorm, but doing no more harm than a flurry of leaves in a spring breeze. Again and again, 3 times, 4 times, 5 and more he slammed into the circle, and the 2 little Haints clung to me for dear life of a sort, and I held them tight like they was a part of me. We stayed there that way for a good while till long after sunup. Then all was quiet, and the butler was gone off to sulk and lick his wounds and figure on what he was gonna try next, which gave me all the time needed to clean the kids. Clean is the best way I can say it. But what I did was release them of all the horrors and memories of what had been done to them by the butler, to let 'em go sweet and clean like the day they was made back into the great by and by. I let them out through an opening I'd set up into the aethers above the circle that the butler could not reach no matter what he did, and I chuckled at the thought of him raging around my door like a toothless old wolf. Then, when I knew the kids were good and gone and there was nothing more could be done to them, I set my thoughts on the butler himself, and oh, what thoughts they were. Now, me not being a saintly man, never claimed I was, I had no such plans of washing the butler clean of his sins and misdeeds, and then sending him to the promised land. No, sir. I am no saintly man, and I cared nothing for any sob story of his on how he got tangled up with a leech in the first place. There's no accident in any of that, and sure as hell no innocence to it. Old Jack Henderson was going to be his ending, and that's all there was to it. So I went back and gathered up a whole other set of gewgaws and doodads, tinctures and oils and whatnots, and set afire some very different herbs and spices that turned the room black with an oily haze that made me cover my face with a rag so as I didn't breathe too much of it in. Then I called on some of those ancient ways and means I know of that never was human, and they were more than happy to set their sights and appetites on the likes of the butler man. And then he came, sniffing around, but against his will this time, but pretending to be the man in charge of things, and all I could do was laugh. I'd prepared this special jar just for the butler, and when he came nosing around into that jar, called to it by the salts and extracts inside, he just could not refuse. Then I knew I had him, and by all the gods and devils, I surely did. When he was fully inside that jar, I slammed the lid shut and sealed it over tight with a hex wax seal I had on hand, and then sat back enjoying the sweet sound of his howls bouncing off the walls of the jar. And there you have it. Never again would the butler do any harm or malice on any man or beast.
Henderson sat back, good and satisfied with his telling, a big smile on his face as he called for more drinks. "That was one hell of a yarn, sir," I said, taking down the rest of it and starting to put away my notebook on which I'd scribbled all that he was laying on me.
Oh, not so fast there, old boyo. Not so fast. The telling of this story is long from done. You think I keep me a collection of foul haints locked up in jars about my secret digs and hidey holes or in my home of all homes? Lord, no, sir. Once I had secured that jar and its lonesome contents, I needed a place of safekeeping so it would never again cause harm to anybody, but stay forever in the hands of somebody whose line is just that very thing. So this was my next move. I called up a buddy of mine of long and favored standing down New Orleans way, fella named Christoph. Now, Christoph, he's a fine right juju man of the highest order, and well-placed among the old ways. I call him up, and he says, "Come you right down, my fine friend, and we'll fix this haint of yours up real good with the Baron Samedi himself, the Lord of the Crossroads, and the dealer in deaths both righteous and profane, whatever's needed and called for." So I packed up the jar good and tight and set out for New Orleans by train, a trip of some days' journey. When I arrive, I meet my buddy at his place, Christoph's potions, spells, herbs, and whatnots, a fine emporium of all that's needed and desired to set you up in the conjure way. I handed that jar over to Christoph, and that's the end of my part in the matter. Next day, Christoph and we catch up on old times, a thing long overdue, and we make short work of a fine meal, and a few excellent bottles of very old rum in the bargain.
Postscript. In New Orleans, there's a very, very old church that some say is long abandoned, and others say is forgotten or torn down years ago. Some say it never existed in the first place, except to scare folks into keeping to the straight and narrow. But none can rightly say just where it might be found. Them that know would never say or even admit to ever hearing tell of it. Christoph Knoll found himself in possession of a very foul jar of crude design, sealed over with a wax doodad etched with ciphers he did not wish to look on too closely. The church aforementioned was deep in a forbidden place and disavowed of newfangled ways and means, and folks of money who sought to turn New Orleans into a place it was never meant to be, and fought bloody tooth and claw and nail to resist. The church aforementioned was damn near hidden deep in the bayou by the cypress and the long widow's hair of ancient moss and mold that takes hold of everything it has a mind to. On a night chosen especially for the task at hand, Christoph Knoll of the New Orleans Knolls descended into the unlit catacombs beneath that church, bearing in his two hands a lantern, a jar, and a standing welcome from the Lord of the Crossroads. Down and down Christoph passed deeper and deeper into the earth by way of a staircase that opened up beneath a trapdoor of peculiar design that was so heavy it was almost too much for a man to bear. He traveled through tunnels large and small, all alight with hex lamps and smudge pots, and a heat that would suffocate a man, was that man not there by special invite of the Baron Samedi. Not being a social call, Christoph stopped at the heavy carved black door at the end of that warren of tunnels. Then he set the jar on the ground before the door, knocked once, then he ran like hell back the way he had come, and clean out of the bayou altogether. Even though the Baron was Kristoff's own true patron, it didn't set well to waste his time or try to sit by while thinking you might socialize or pass the time of day. All time spent with the Baron has a heavy price that must be paid on account, and it's best to forestall that account until it can no longer be avoided. Even if the Baron means you no harm and has taken a liking to you, which was surely the case with Kristoff Knoll of the New Orleans Knolls. A short time later, the Baron Samedi sat upon his throne of skulls, in his secret place of high juju that none may enter except the dead. He considered the jar in his hand as a man might ponder a glittering snifter of exceptionally fine cognac, taking its measure and savoring the heady aroma of all he was about to enjoy at his leisure. For Kristoff, for his friend Jack Henderson, who had done him a good turn now and then, and for those little kids who had never done no wrong to any man, and especially for the butler man haint himself. The Baron Samedi picked off the wax seal from the jar with a long, slender finger like a mama going after a fresh jar of preserves. He breathed in long and deep of what sought hard to escape that jar, and he started to laugh. The Baron's laughter was damn near drowned out by the smells of agony and the screams of fear that flowed from the jar, and filled the air like a noxious incense. The last of the haint of the butler and what he carried was swallowed up whole into the Baron, and took its place among those destined to spend an eternity in torment and woe, or until the Baron grew tired of him. The screams finally melted away into pitiful sobs that soon enough died away altogether. All there was left then was the laughter of the Baron, which some later took to be a crack of mighty thunder, or the coming of the very judgment day itself, depending on their constitution. Most folks just figure it was some peculiar sort of doings in the conjure way that was none of their business after all, and best paid no never mind.
On March the 3rd, 1984, Detective Yalmerson of the Houghton Police Department acquired a stack of papers, freshly typed, from a deserted hotel room on the second floor of the Best Western overlooking the canal. A 32-year-old man, James H. Kowalczyk, had rented the room the preceding 3 nights. According to staff, Kowalczyk did not leave his room after arrival, at least not to their knowledge, until sometime after 11 p.m. on the night of March the 2nd. He was a quiet guest. Occasionally, they heard him talking to someone, presumably on the telephone. Management alerted the police when a housekeeper found his abandoned belongings. In addition to the papers, he had left behind his suitcase, wallet, car keys, typewriter, coat, an audio cassette player, and 5 cassettes. To date, no one has found any sign of what happened to Kowalczyk. He led a solitary life, unremarkable in any way, except for the manuscript he left behind. I obtained the original papers in early 1998 through an anonymous source. Witness, James H. Kowalczyk, to whom it concerns. No instrument can match the seduction of the human voice. The rhythms, the cadences, the pitches, the sliding and trembling vowels followed by a click or a little patter of the tongue on the roof of the mouth. Words are incidental, afterthoughts. Nothing can haunt you or fool you like the intonations of a voice. I shouldn't have played the cassettes. To think how long those frozen syllables lingered around the spools, wound up in fury and desperation. How did they not wear thin? The voices of Lottie and the lady became clearer every time I listened. It was like the tape got stronger the more it spun. I could have gotten a job somewhere far away, maybe San Francisco. Could have ditched the Midwest. I was not untalented. I could have made a life. But these two towns, Houghton and Hancock, crawling up the steep hills on either side of the canal, would not relinquish their grip. The weathered brick smelter and its narrow smokestacks loomed along the horizons of my daydreams. Voices from the deep woods, dirt logging roads, and dripping mines of the Keweenaw Peninsula had called, reaching me through the cassettes, and I could not tune them out. Well, no help to think that way. From this window, where I watched the snow whirl down into the black canal, I shudder with the red lights blinking in alternation from the opposing towers of the lift bridge. Two mute watchers, flashing dull signals. Then I glimpse my haggard reflection, half realized in the window, a pale face from another dimension, full of regret for what could have been. But I have to keep going until I find her. I chose this path. I lived here for a couple of years. Well, in Hancock, on the other side of the canal, the gateway to the Keweenaw Peninsula. In all the United States, Hancock houses the largest proportion of Finnish Americans, with their long names full of vowels and double consonants, almost always ending in nen or la. Some still call the place Kuparasari, meaning Copper Island, a land of dense woods, rocky outcroppings, desolate beaches, harsh winters, sparse inhabitants, and old brick foundations besieged by moss and ivy. The Keweenaw Peninsula pokes into frigid Lake Superior like a displaced mass of human memory. Once you cross the lift bridge from Houghton to Hancock, you've entered an island adrift on the sea of time, tenuously tied to a neglected corner of the American mainland. It was 1977. Until then, I'd spent my entire life in Illinois, born and raised in Fox Lake, completing my undergraduate and master's at DePaul. I was studying comparative religions at Suomi College while working part-time as a clerk at a law firm. They always gave me the shittiest work. I was a PhD candidate, for Christ's sake, and they had me collating documents. They couldn't figure out the settings on the new copier. "Peter's done. Someone needs to clean out his office," Mr. Magnuson snapped beside the paper cutter where I stood clutching a handful of oversized paper clips. Peter Lottie has been there for 30 years. He had sued every auto insurer in the Keweenaw. He'd won quite a few cases, some real big ones, representing employees and retirees of the Quincy Mine, the Red Jacket Mine, the Franklin Mine, the Cliff Mine. All of them now closed. The firm used to joke that he had shut them all down, that they went broke paying out his clients, they said. It should come as no surprise that he made plenty of enemies, and tons of admirers too. But he'd cracked. In 1970, something had crawled up between his ribcage and cut out the bottom of his heart. His decline was steady, as if an anchor had tied to his collarbone, pulling his narrow chest and bony shoulders down toward hell. His eyes burned holes into the carpet, then flitted up past your head as he spoke, as if afraid his words would make a ceiling tile drop. I only saw his final 2.5 years. A sinking ghost, the weight hung heavy, his neck strained to keep his eyes off the floor. At first, I thought he avoided eye contact out of arrogance, as if I were too lowly to acknowledge. After a couple of months, I started to suspect something else. He knew he was a shadow. He knew how awful he was to behold, and he was afraid of infecting anyone else with his wraith-like wasting. After those first couple of months, I hardly saw him again. He would disappear into his office behind the frosted glass panel of his closed door. A soft light would glow into the night. I would hear little clicks and muted voices. He'd still be there when I left at 5 p.m. The next morning, it would look like he hadn't slept at all. In fact, at least 3 times he wore the same clothing as the night before. But he wasn't working any cases, not that any of us knew of. Magnuson and the others put up with him because of his legacy. They handed him documents to review, even though they'd already reviewed them. At times, they already had filed a brief before giving it to him. He didn't notice, and he offered no comments. They kept paying his senior partner's share, even though he'd contributed nothing. It was just too sad for everyone. His last big case, the wrongful death lawsuit against the Quincy Mining Company, had fizzled out to nothing. His client, thoroughly discredited before trial, fled to Canada. He said there aren't many files that need to be preserved, Mr. Magnuson said, peering over his bifocals, sitting in a leather swivel chair. There may be a few for storage. Check the dates. But most, if not all, can be shredded. I had seen the interior of Lottie's office a handful of times over the past year. Partial glimpses as the hunched man shambled in and out. A high-ceilinged room with shelves of legal tomes sagging along the walls, black and pale green filing cabinets, tall antique armchairs. I dreaded the prospect of sifting through this musty mess he'd left behind. He particularly mentioned materials from the Kukula case, Magnuson droned. Interview cassettes. Destroy them. My job description did not include cleaning, but I had learned not to ask questions of Mr. Magnuson, so I accepted my assignment without inquiry or complaint. When he handed me a thick bronze key, his eyes dropped back to the brief in his hands. He swiveled away from me. I left. It felt like walking into a sacred and forsaken past. The wood-paneled room was a compartment of Lottie's mind, preserved against the vicious gravity that had assaulted his body. Newspaper clippings from 7 years ago and older sat beneath paperweights. Why wasn't Lottie cleaning out the office himself? Wouldn't he know the documents better than anyone? These were questions I should have asked Mr. Magnuson, but I didn't. The quiet office seemed like a convenient escape. I thought I could turn it into a 2-day project at least. Sifting through the large filing cabinets was tedious, but did not take as long as I'd expected. By 4:15, I was nearly done, having neatly arranged and labeled a stack of banker's boxes by the door. That's when I turned to the narrow green cabinet nestled against Lottie's desk. I had to rummage around in his rollout drawer to find the key, buried among 1,000 unused pencils. The top drawer of the cabinet was empty. The bottom drawer was where I found them. Those damned, drowned voices that have never stopped spinning through the background of my uneventful life. A precise hand had written Kukula v. Quincy Smelter in black marker on each of the cassette cases. There were 5 subtitles: Interview of Catherine Kukula, Interview of Benjamin Faircrown, Interview of Foreman Sapanin, Interview of Catherine Kukula Part 2, and Interview of blank. Someone had scribbled out the name of the last interviewee. Had I known what I know now, I would have built a bonfire that night and watched until every inch of tape had melted. Of course, even had I tried, I'll bet the voices would have slipped out through the flames, curling up inside the smoke, twisting green fumes into my nostrils, infiltrating my mind. You cannot kill voices like those. In any case, it's too late to reflect. The snow keeps folding into the black canal's surface like minuscule white feathers dissolving into a highway of obsidian. Soon, I will walk the lift bridge to what awaits me on the other side. I cannot stop now what I have returned. Most of the partners had left the office. I pushed the first cassette into the player, shoved the panel shut, and clicked the button. Sitting in Lottie's red, high-backed armchair, I listened with the volume low. After some static, I heard voices. For the sake of brevity, I will omit the tedious, lawyerly questions and leave only what is necessary for context. I must note that Lottie's voice sounded different from when I had heard him in real life. There was a crispness, a lilt, as if every time he spoke he expected his words to lead to an answer, or at least a course of action. In short, he sounded confident that a truth obtainable by language existed. I listened close. Interview of Catherine Kukula, March the 17th, 1970, 8:00 a.m. The sound of shuffling paper. Do you, Mrs. Kukula, agree to this interview being recorded for my own investigative purposes? I do. I do not betray the confidences of my clients. Anything you say will not be shared unless you agree. Thank you. Sound of shuffling paper. How long were you and your husband married? A year. Well, it would have been a year on the 15th of this month. I'm sorry. And have you two always lived in Hancock? No, not always. I was born in Copper Harbor. Tom was from Amik. We met in Houghton a year and a half ago. Then, we moved across the canal into Hancock, right onto Quincy Street, when Tom got his promotion. Promotion at the Quincy smelter, correct? Correct. And is it still your belief that the operations of the Quincy smelter are responsible for the death of your husband? I have no doubt. And how did you come to this belief? Because one of them confessed to me. What? Why didn't you share this before? Because I didn't want to trouble you. Trouble me? We could easily get such an admission into trial, depending on the nature of what was said. Did they put it in writing? No. One of them met with me. When? A week ago. A week after Tom died. How did this meeting come about? I went to Tom's office. A pause. It seems the tape skips several seconds, but misses no dialogue. Go on. I found myself walking through the corridors of the office building. Tom had left his key at home. I was looking for his coat. I thought maybe he had left it in his office. I wandered to a strange wooden door at the back of a long hallway. I know that I shouldn't have opened it, but I couldn't help it. I needed to find Tom's coat. I was worried he was cold. Even though he was dead, I worried he was shivering. She stops speaking for a moment. Glass clinks.
Around a conference room table, I saw them, lit by a circle of dim, fluorescent table lamps discussing blueprints projected on the wall. One of them turned to look at me. The others didn't seem to notice. Who was there? The board of directors of the Quincy Mining Company? I mean, the real board of directors. Go on. The one who turned to me, he was old. He was hunched. No one could have been that old. He told me I couldn't be there. He would meet me at the lift bridge. So I walked there, to the middle of the bridge, to meet him. I don't remember stopping at home, but I must have, because then I had my scarf with me. It was cold. The canal was frozen. To meet whom? J.T. Blackdoon, Sr.
Sound of shuffling paper.
I haven't heard of him. I told you, he's one of the directors. The real directors. What do you mean? Her servants, Mr. Lottie. Whose? The Lady of the Hollows.
A pounding on the office door made me jump. I clicked pause, pretending to be absorbed with wiping down the narrow green cabinet. I looked up at Mr. Magnuson standing in the doorway. "I don't know why I knocked," he muttered. "Habits. Funny things, aren't they?" Beneath his thick, arched eyebrows, a pair of eyes judged me. "You don't have to finish that tonight. It's not urgent." "Oh, that's okay. I'd rather get it all done at once," I said without thinking. "I should be able to wrap up in the next couple of hours." Mr. Magnuson squinted as he placed his driving glasses on. "Then you'll be the last one out. Make sure you lock up." "Okay." I waited for the sound of his car rolling down the hill before resuming the tape. My hands were shaking. Once I had settled down, I gazed at a faded newspaper clipping tacked to a cork pencil holder on the desk. The headline read, "Mechanical Engineer Dies in Accident at Quincy Smelter." A photograph of Tom Kukula showed a handsome young man with a thick, blonde mustache. I thought of going home, but the voice of Catherine would not leave my head. Never had I heard such mingled calmness and fright. She had to be insane. But if I did not hear the conclusion, I would not be able to sleep. I was haunted by the low tone she had used when she pronounced Lady of the Hollows. I had to hear just how crazy she was in order to comfort myself. So, I clicked the play button.
Who? Excuse me? The Lady of the Hollows. Who is she? I don't know what you're talking about. I've never heard that name. You just said it. You said they were her servants. No. I was explaining that Tom knew all of the safety protocols. He was the de facto safety educator at the smelter. There's no way he could have fallen over the handrail. And not wearing any gear? That's not what you were saying, Mrs. Kukula. I know what I was saying. What are you trying to do? Are you trying to trap me? Aren't you supposed to be my attorney?
Burst of static. I have replayed this section of the cassette many times, as I believe a third voice begins to speak, very suddenly cut off. The voice is so faint, however, that no matter how much I magnify the volume, I never have made out whether it truly was someone else in the room, or nothing more than a radio in a car passing outside Lottie's office.
I didn't mean to upset you. Please, go on.
I will spare you by saying that the rest of the interview proceeds without oddity. Catherine makes no more mention of sleepwalking, a secret board of directors, or the Lady of the Hollows. Lottie asks her questions about the accident, and Catherine describes how Tom had been warning the company for months about safety concerns in the smelter. She goes into the specifics with an impressive attention to detail. She was every bit as intelligent as her husband, and evidently appreciated the intricacies of his work. If you listen close, you will notice hints of a wavering trepidation in Lottie's voice. He no longer lilts, his sentences no longer seem confident of finding their endings. Looking back, I think it was his growing hesitation, the audible record of his thoughts succumbing to nothingness that drew me in with a rope around my wrist. His faltering led me onward, against my will, to the edge of the well where intonations reverberate blind and disjointed, to where our words fail. By the time I had finished the tape, through its drawn-out and anticlimactic conclusion, the window of the office was pitch black. The wind whistled through a fissure in the frame. Lottie evidently had given up on caulking the thing. The sagging wooden building they used as an office had all sorts of problems like this. Wind was always sneaking in through the cracks. I don't know why they didn't move. How did Lottie tolerate the infernal whistling? I went to the supply room, found a half-used canister of caulk, and sealed it shut. The room became silent. So silent. So silent, in fact, I realized how alone I was. Even if I walked home to my apartment up the hill, I would be no less alone. This place, the Keweenaw with its peeling tar paper roofs and brick streets, was alien to me. The people with their thick northern accents and dated clothing were alien, and I've never been any good at making friends. So, I went back to the cassettes. I could not listen to more of Catherine, and I did not want to hear more about the smelter. So, I grabbed the one labeled Benjamin Faircrown, as nothing I'd seen in the newspaper clippings gave me any indication as to who he was. In the silent room, that quieted chamber of Lottie's mind, the static erupted like a volcano. I welcomed the grating disturbance and the voices that floated like ash trails around me.
Interview of Benjamin Faircrown, March the 19th, 1970, 1:00 p.m.
A scratching noise and the sound of the tape seemingly rewinding itself.
Interview of Benjamin Faircrown, March the 19th, 1970, 1:00 p.m.
Wind blows in the background. Birds chirp.
Mr. Faircrown, I want to ask you about your neighbor, Catherine Kukula. Yeah, of course. Anything to help? How long have you been neighbors? Oh, they moved in now. What was it? A year ago? She and her husband, Tom. Good folk. Did you ever notice any odd behavior? What's odd to you?
The wind blows hard. The first half of what Lottie says is muffled beyond hearing.
Reality. Did she talk to herself? Did she see things that no one else could see? Well, sure. She talked to herself. Who doesn't now and then? But she had a good head on her shoulders, especially considering all she'd gone through. Like what?
The wind stops. Utter silence.
Don't you know about her first husband?
A branch crashed on the roof. I heard it scrape the shingles as it slid, and I tried not to look out the window, out of an irrational fear that something outside would see me looking and would turn its eyes on me. But it was just a branch.
No, she did not. 7 years ago, almost the day of Tom's death, she lost Paul in a boating accident near Isle Royal. How? He ran a charter, but one night he went out by himself. No one knew why. Never came back. He washed up on the rocks. Did she ever talk to you about it?
Loud squealing sound. A long pause. When Benjamin resumes, his voice sounds different. He speaks low, as if afraid of someone overhearing.
You shouldn't blame her. Blame her? For what? She came from Corellia, a persecuted land. Therefore, persecution is all she's ever known. She was born in Copper Harbor. The Lady of the Hollows was brought by accident from far away. When the fishermen realized what she was, they burned her with marks, then buried her in the cold. They concealed it, tried to make everyone forget. Now, she calls her witnesses. This is no crime, not under the laws of men and women, not under the laws of any god. The witnesses go willingly. Every 7 years, another testament. Her voice must not, cannot drown. Was it Catherine who told you about the lady?
The wind blows hard, and there is a fluttering sound, like garments flying off a clothesline.
I asked you if it was Catherine who told you about the lady. What?
From here repeats the pattern of Lottie's earlier conversation with Catherine. Benjamin Faircrown denies having said anything about a woman from Corellia or a previous husband of Catherine's. He gives credible and detailed descriptions of the Kukula's unremarkable presence in the neighborhood. Finally, Lottie, exasperated, losing the ability or will to ask further questions, shuts off the tape. You can almost see the leaden weight of his fingertip as it smashes the button in defeat. I replayed both of the tapes, wondering if perhaps their words had been misheard or misunderstood. But they both had said those things they later denied. The tapes do not lie. I thought with sadness of Lottie's last 7 years, loitering around this office with no direction, his inner compass demagnetized. If he continued to struggle with these delusional people, dealing with tragedy by way of strange but understandable dissociations, I could sympathize. I saw the beginnings of his ghost-like transformation. At least, this is what I thought at the time, before I had listened to the remaining cassettes.
Interview of Ed Sepanen, March the 18th, 1970, 9:00 a.m. Foreman, Quincy Smelter. Hold on now. Do you have to record all of this? It's for my own investigation. I double-check for consistency. If I were to summarize the statements, I'd omit details and reword things according to my own inclinations. It would become my own narrative. That's no help to anyone. You didn't record her, did you? Who?
A chair screeches against the floor.
Stop recording. Stop! All right, just settle down. Give me a second.
The tape clicks. It clicks again. Static. Another click. More static. Finally, Sepanen resumes. He seems to be chanting in a rhythmic language, then abruptly stops.
He stood on top of the guardrail and threw himself in, just like I said in the report. He stretched his arms out wide and then into the flames. That reminded me of what my uncle had said about all these accidents over the years. Testament by water, testament by fire. None find anything but whispers, wherever it is they go. Who said that? Just old men's stories, Mr. Lottie. Nothing more.
The chair scrapes against the floor. Footsteps.
You're leaving? There's nothing more to say, Mr. Lottie.
I skimmed through the files. Ed Sapanin had worked at the smelter for 18 years. Not long after the interview, he moved to Sault Ste. Marie. His personal history was normal. He had 3 kids. He liked to fish for northern pike. I remember that I hesitated a long time before inserting the cassette with the second interview of Catherine. In truth, I was becoming terrified of her. There didn't seem to be a reason. Yes, she may have been going mad, but there was nothing overtly incriminating about anything she had said. Perhaps it was the sound of Lottie's voice whenever he mentioned her. It quavered, ever so slightly. I wondered where Lottie was at that moment. I felt a desire to speak with him. Maybe it was because whenever the tapes clicked off, I felt so profoundly alone. I needed to know that someone else had heard these things. I needed to hear a confirming voice that wasn't on a cassette. It was getting late. I already had missed my routine bedtime, meaning that no matter when I turned in, tomorrow would be a drag. I had come this far, though. I might as well finish what I had started. I inserted the tape. The sound of furniture being rearranged. A long silence.
Why do you need to interview me again? I told you everything the first time. I need you to hear something.
A click. The tape of the first interview plays, but the sleepwalking account of Catherine is not there. It is gone. The interview moves straight to the account of the smelter and Tom's safety concerns. A click. The noises of people shifting position, it seems.
Mr. Lottie, are you okay? It was there. That's impossible. What are you trying to show me? The things you said. The first things. Have you requested the incident reports yet? Yes, they're on my desk. I haven't had a chance to fully review. I see. I don't know that I get what you're trying to find. I'll show you what Benjamin Faircrown said. Who? Your neighbor, the one next door. There's no one next door. We're on a corner lot. The house next to us has been empty for years.
A click. The tape of the interview with Benjamin Faircrown plays uninterrupted. The occasional sound of Lottie or Catherine shifting in their seats. A click.
Well, I don't know how to say this. You need to tell me everything. Say it. What about your first husband? I was never married before, Tom. Then why did your neighbors say you were?
Catherine clears her throat, sounding very uncomfortable.
That was your voice, Mr. Lottie. It was lower, but that was you. What? No, I went to his house. We spoke in his yard. There's no one at that house. Whoever he wasn't my neighbor. If you saw someone there, why did you hire me? Oh, Because I heard you're the best. My husband is dead. But now I'm worried that, well, this is all taking a toll on you. You don't look well.
A long silence interspersed with sparks of static.
Thank you, Miss Kakula, for your concern, I mean. But I'm fine. And I think, perhaps, it may just be that the reports won't show. There are other avenues a case has to take sometimes. Thank you for your time. I apologize for... I shouldn't have made you come today. We'll talk on Monday, after I've...
Recording ends. I listened again to the interview with Benjamin Faircrown. Could Catherine have been right? The voice of Faircrown did sound remarkably similar to that of Lottie. Had his professional reputation as an attorney fooled me? But there was a difference in quality between the two voices. Marked distinctions in the mannerisms, the intonations. Lottie would have had to have been an incredible actor. And that seemed improbable, given what I knew. And the things Foreman Sepanen had said were strange. But would they have been so strange if I hadn't heard them after hearing the conversation with Faircrown? But no. I had heard Catherine speak of the Lady of the Hollows, too. I replayed it many times to make sure that it was real. Lottie could not have mimicked that voice. Unless he had spent so many years alone with these tapes. There were indeed peculiarities in the recordings. Only one tape remained, the one with the scribbled-out name. Something inside me said I should stop. My inner compass, which I ignored, was pointing me away. I could go home to my empty, quiet apartment. I could sleep. I could listen to or destroy the tapes tomorrow. I sat there for a long while, uneasy in Lottie's tall chair, staring at the green filing cabinet. Thinking I heard a branch snap on the ground outside, I stood up as if to leave, then chided myself for giving in to the paranoia the cassettes had induced. I wouldn't let my mind get the best of me. I would listen. In defiance of my own fear, I sat down, inserted the final cassette, and clicked the play button. Footsteps. A tapping. Something being dragged. Static. A match is struck. Floorboards creak. Static. A door opening slowly with shrill hinges. The door shuts. Static. The sound of chair legs scratching the floor. When Lottie speaks, he sounds calm but grave.
Interview of J.T. Blackdoon Sr., March the 22nd, 1970, 12:30 a.m. Mr. Blackdoon, do you mind me recording this interview?
Then there arises a voice that sounds much like Lottie's, only slower, deeper, and coarse as gravel. It sounds like Lottie imitating a very old man.
I do not object. Do you serve the Lady of the Hollows? Why don't you ask her yourself? Is Catherine the Lady of the Hollows? Did she kill her husband? You do not need to consult me to answer those questions. What is it you really want to ask? It doesn't make sense. None of this makes sense. Why doesn't anyone remember what they say? What has she done to them? Most everyone tries to forget, but a few, they try to remember. They want others to hear. Those upon whom...
Static.
I only want to know what she's after. No, I don't even need... I only need to know how to stop it. What stops all of this? What should I do? Testify. You know I can't do that. Testify. No, I'd be ruined. You must choose. She is already there, in the hollows of your mind. What will you say? What will you not say? No, it's not all in my head. I'm not crazy. You are not crazy. Why is she doing this to me? She commands no one. She makes you do nothing. You go willingly.
Static explodes. The tape seems to rewind and fast forward in alternation. A flood of incomprehensible whispers.
No, I won't go. I won't go.
The sound of his muttering was difficult to take, but not nearly as difficult as the silence that followed. For the recording continued for 7.5 minutes, though neither voice said another word. There may be a soft sobbing, or laughter, or both. The first interview of Catherine replays, a recording of a recording, and static. Always the static. Then the creaking of floorboards. Then the door closing. The footsteps and taps receding. Click. The tape stops. I sat in the chair, afraid to move, wary of shifting the silent air. It was like the moment when, as a child, you prepare to jump onto your bed, avoiding whatever hands may be waiting to grab you from beneath the box spring. You do it fast and you don't look. You tuck yourselves into your covers. You know it's silly, but sometimes you do it even when you're older. I shoved the cassettes into the file cabinet, locked it, grabbed my coat, shut off the lamp, and fled. I strode up the hill to my apartment, not daring to look down any alley nor into any window. I especially did not look in the direction of the smelter, empty and abandoned by the canal. The next morning, it was no surprise to hear the talk in the office. Peter Lottie had leapt from the top of Lift Bridge. How he got up there, no one could explain. The others seemed sad and ashamed as they gathered around the steaming coffee pot. I felt desperate. I felt myself burdened by the knowledge of all things. Knowing the beginning, I knew the ending. Or rather, I saw there was no beginning, and therefore, no ending. Fictions. There is no controlling things. That evening, after everyone else had left, I gathered the cassettes and stowed them away in my apartment. I began making plans to move. I never finished my doctorate. 3 months later, I fled downstate to the lower peninsula. I thought about tossing the cassettes out my window as I drove beside the long, sagging cables of the Mackinac Bridge. I could have thrown them to the waves, to sink, to drown. to be quieted forever. But there is no real escape from a voice once you've heard it. Half a page of blank space separates the final paragraphs of the manuscript, which seem to have been typed at a later time. I hear them through the walls. When the sliding doors open, the croaking commandments slip in with the wind drifting through the lobby. There are no young voices here, but from across the canal, from over the crests of Quincy Hill and Mount Ripley, from some undisturbed glen, secreted away in shadow from the grinding machinations of time. She sings a muttering song, and my heart screws tight because there by the canal, out my hotel window, I see her. Finally. After all these years. A hazy outline in the falling snow. A white blur erases her feet, making her wavy body seem to float. Frost coats her bare arms, and yet she does not shiver. A thin, glittering arm reaches out to beckon me with an open hand. I want to see her eyes, but they are lost in shadow. Is that what I will look like? Will my lips turn blue and shadows surround my eyes? I remember what Benjamin Faircrown said. You cannot blame her. Look at the jagged icicles dangling from her young, white hair. I feel she is not only a tormentor, but a victim. She, like myself, is woven into a circle of persecution she did not choose. No beginning, no ending. You can't recite it away. Lottie's stammering hesitation haunts me. For the last 7 years, I have felt my own voice fading away. I do not want it to disappear forever. It is better to merge than die. I leave this so all may know. When she called, I went willingly. I felt I owed it to her. After all, I'd done no more than Lottie to find out the truth. He left the cassettes. I leave these papers. And now, you have read these things. Understand the spools will not stop spinning until they have entwined your own voice into the relentless loops. You will follow the path of Lottie and myself, and who knows how many others into the forgiving cold or annihilating heat. Whichever we choose, we, the lesser witnesses. As long as her whispers linger out there in the hills and waters, she will call for you too, until you go to where we all go, to the earthen chasms where our voices mingle and fade. And so, when at last you hear the whistle through your bedroom window turn to a murmur, what testament will you leave? The Lady of the Hollows. Witness James H. Kowalczyk. When Detective Yolmerson listened to the 5 unlabeled cassettes, he found no references to J.T. Blackdoon or the Lady of the Hollows. nor did he find a single interview of Catherine Kukula. The unusual details reported by Kowalczyk simply did not exist. The only disturbing element was the last cassette, in which Lottie did in fact hold a conversation with himself. He debated the details uncovered by his investigation from two opposing points of view, trying to determine whether or not Miss Kukula had been responsible for her husband's death. Far from reflecting an abrupt slide into insanity, the one-person dialogue seemed like the rational process of an intelligent man, trying to reconcile contradictory facts, struggling to determine his ethical duty in the event his client had committed murder due to an underlying mental illness. Having listened to Lottie's unsettling observations about Catherine, Detective Hjalmarsson reopened the case of Tom Kukula's death at the Quincy smelter 14 years prior, but found himself at an immediate dead end. The smelter had ceased operations over 10 years ago. All reports of the incident were lost. Moreover, no evidence showed that Tom Kukula ever had been married. There was no Catherine Kukula, neither according to private interviews nor to public records. Hjalmarsson determined the case was nothing but an elaborate hoax, then closed the file. When I tracked down Hjalmarsson, his former colleagues either could not or would not tell me where he went. He retired on short notice in 1991. In his final years, he had shown signs of rapid mental deterioration, speaking in mumbled half-sentences. I based my report on the few comments he made to colleagues, as well as documents I received pursuant to a Freedom of Information Act request. Perhaps I should note one last thing that was shared with me, under condition of anonymity. She was a junior detective at the time of Hjalmarsson's retirement. In the final months before his departure, whenever the snow was falling, she would find Hjalmarsson alone in his office, his chair turned away from his desk, staring with glassy eyes at the frozen canal. When the junior detective asked what he was looking at, Hjalmarsson replied, "A highway of obsidian, a man without a coat walking down it, getting buried, getting forgiven, dissolving." She asked what he was talking about, if he was still working the Kowalczyk case, in response to which he chuckled and replied, "There's nothing to solve. This is no crime, not under the laws of men and women, not under the laws of any god." She asked him to say more, but he acted as if he hadn't heard. Author's note. After some digging, I found there was a Paul Johnson who died in 1963, but his body was not found among the rocks of Isle Royal, nor anywhere. In his boat, docked at Copper Harbor, the police found what they described as an incoherent suicide letter. There was no record of him marrying. Author's note. A people, region, and culture split by the modern border of Finland and Russia. Karelia is of special significance to Finnish history and mythology. The national instrument, the kantele, was created there. Rune singers were prominent. The political past is torn and bitter. Kowalczyk's note. I've never found any evidence that a man named Benjamin Faircrown lived in the Keweenaw. Author's note. I too have found no records of Benjamin Faircrown. I did find a Ben Fulcrow, who lived near Lac La Belle from the 1930s and 50s. He was a fisherman. Sometime after returning from war in 1945, he chose to live in self-imposed exile, growing vegetables, refusing to interact with any of his neighbors. People guessed that he had seen something traumatic, probably during his time overseas. He had some kind of falling out with the other fishermen over something that happened on the frozen lake one winter in the late 40s. Kowalczyk's note. I consulted Professor Tapio of Suomi College. She said it was the Karelian dialect and that Ed Sepanin was chanting a tiataja, a kind of rune song. Professor Tapio did not recognize many of the words. This rune song seemed very archaic in her opinion, dating back perhaps as far as the mid-17th century. I lost her handwritten translation years ago when I moved downstate. What stood out to me then, and what I recall now, is that she believed the function of this rune song was protective. It explained origins of valleys. By reciting it, one called upon the valley's spirit to contain something, and Professor Tapio did not recognize the word, that had been secured between the hills. Author's note. Kowalczyk incorrectly refers to what Sepanin chanted as a tiataja, when the correct term would be a sinti. A sinti is a metric incantatory poem that explains the origin of a phenomenon or entity. Finnish shamans, or more literally, knowers, were referred to as tiatajat. A fundamental wisdom of the tiatajat is that in order to control something, whether it be a flood, a storm, a disease, a famine, an animal, or an emotion, one must not only know, but recite its origins. Author's note. Apparently, Lottie detailed a number of incriminating pieces of evidence that Kowalczyk either did not notice or did not care to include in his excerpts. For example, Lottie said that 2 witnesses had observed Tom and Catherine eating dinner at Andriani's in downtown Hancock, not less than an hour before his death. Foreman Sepanin said Tom had complained about, and I quote, his woman, wanting him to run the tests at the smelter that late in the evening, when he, referring to Tom, thought it could wait until morning. Catherine knew details of the moments leading up to his death that only someone within the smelter could have known. Her fingerprints may have been found on a handrail. Author's note. I identified a Katerina, or Catherine, Lasko, who had been born in Copper Harbor at approximately the right time to be the same age as Catherine, but locals assured me she had married and relocated to Green Bay in the 1960s. Interestingly, there was an earlier Katerina Lasko, apparently unrelated, who came as a refugee from Soviet-controlled Eastern Karelia after the Continuation War. She threw herself under the ice of Lac La Belle in 1949, at the age of 21. This case momentarily distracted me from my purpose, for the details surrounding her death were fascinating. She had committed what can only be called a ritualistic suicide, imitating the features of semi-preserved murder victims discovered in European bogs, such as the Tolland Man and the Yidde Girl. She had shaved part of her head and tied ropes around her limbs. In addition, it appeared she had branded her wrists with a distorted version of the Hanun Veokana, the looping Finnish symbol of luck and protection. According to the original account, a group of ice fishermen tried in vain to restrain her before she cast herself into a fishing hole. There was not enough material here to distract me for long. However, despite this wild account, none of the locals seemed able to remember the earlier Katerina having existed at all.
Chilling tales for dark nights.